I immigrated to the United States from Russia 10 years ago, but before that, I was a truck driver. I often drove the route with the seemingly innocuous name of the M56, a road that Stalin had built with the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. They were people the state had, in effect, condemned to death, and the state didn't want them back. About half of them died. They froze to death, starved and collapsed from exhaustion. And to this day, many drivers swear they see ghosts on the M56. Traveling up on the M56, I would come to the Koloma Highway, which translated means the Road of Bones. It isn't a metaphor. When the Gulag prisoners died constructing these roads, they wouldn't bury their bodies due to the permafrost making the ground too hard. So the prisoners' bones were mixed in with the road and covered over. The road itself literally has the bones of many tens of thousands of people mixed in. To call the M56 or the Road of Bones roads gives the wrong impression, at least on the last time that I drove the route back in 2010. It isn't a paved road, but covered in stones laid thickly over the Siberian dirt that turns into quicksand when it rains. The M56 runs straight north into Siberia, and there are still countless deaths on this road. It often washes out and portions of the road would just collapse. Massive dust storms sweep across it, causing collisions and deaths as trucks and cars swerved into trees or passed into the other side of the road. And my cargo was entirely uninsured. I drove with tons of beer and glass bottles in the back, some of which ended up shattering from the endless vibrations of driving over the sharp rocks all over the road, which also ended up slicing up my tires. I would go through over 15 tires a month, sometimes 25. Take a truck loaded with between 15 to 18 tons of beer and blow out a tire, and you could be sitting on an instantaneous fatal crash waiting to happen. All down the M56, you would see thousands and thousands of discarded tires on the sides of the road. As for the beer, the people living in northern Siberia loved beer. I think they drank it more than water. And beer is more popular there than vodka, despite the fact that it's Russia. Maybe beer is cheaper than bottled water. In some places it is. The story of my encounter on the M56 started before I had stopped at the warehouse dock to load up 15 tons of beer in my aging second-hand Japanese truck. It started when I saw a man standing outside just staring at me. He had very dark eyes and a round Siberian face with ruddy cheeks. He wore a fur jacket, but I couldn't tell which animal that it had come from. He looked bundled up, with sweaters and multiple layers of pants. The fur coat also included a hood, which still had the face of the animal attached, though flattened and distorted. I immediately recognized that it had come from a brown bear. I got out of my truck, lighting up a cigarette, and I started walking in his direction, pulling my jacket closed and putting a thick woolen hat on my head. The wind whipped crazily all around me, sending the snow sideways and directly into my face. I cursed, trying to turn my head. The front door stood just beside the strange man, and I needed to go inside. Might as well start the paperwork now, I figured. The man just kept staring, however, even as I got near. I was about to ask if he had a problem when he started speaking. "You are going on Kolma, the Road of Bones?" he asked. "Yeah, I take the M56 north first," I said. "That's my job. I travel here and I travel there. As long as most of the cargo doesn't get broken or fall off the truck, I make a decent living." "You should not go alone," he said. "The Road of Bones will break you, it will crush you, as it crushed the bones of those who built it. You will not survive this journey, my friend, not alone." I laughed, but a chill ran down my spine. What are you, some kind of Siberian shaman? I asked. He smiled but said nothing. Are you a psychic, friend? Do you tell me my future? I only tell the truth, he said. No more and no less. Many thought that they would survive the road of bones. Most still lay there, skulls eternally grinning under the wheels that pass over them. So what are you asking me? I said. I'm not asking you anything, he said. But if you want any chance to survive, I should come with you. I will travel with you to Magadan, at the end of the road of bones, and then you will be free. You will have seen the true nature of the road of bones, and maybe you'll be alive. I squinted at the man, wondering if I was talking to a madman or a drunkard, but he seemed completely coherent and logical. I wondered if maybe this was just the strangest hitchhiking ruse that anybody had ever dreamed up. I stepped back, feeling cold. The smell of fumes from the other trucks pulling into the warehouse parking lot mixed with the scent of the evergreens that surrounded us here at the edge of town. What's your name? I asked him, looking closer at the skin of his fur coat. It looked like a bear. It felt too hot standing next to the heat of the warehouse to be wearing fur. Yakov, he said. In my town, they call me Yakov the Seer. I suppressed a slight smile at this. Yakov, my name is Nikolai. Yes, I am a truck driver. Why do you not just ask me for a ride? Because I want you to prepare yourself, he said cryptically. And then he would say nothing else on the subject, but simply told me that he would come back once my cargo had been loaded. I smiled and shook his hand, but as I walked away, I felt him staring at my back. And goosebumps rose on my arms and legs, and I wondered whether I had made the right call. Soon the truck was loaded and I was ready to leave the lot. I stood in front of the door and I looked around for Yakov, but the thick snow obscured my vision. I couldn't see farther than 15 or 20 feet in any direction. Shrugging, I pulled myself into the driver's seat and pulled the door closed. The warm air from the truck made my tingling toes and fingers warm up. I took off my snow-covered jacket and hat. The smell of wet wool still reminds me of winter to this day. And then there was a sudden rapping at my window. I jumped, reaching under my seat for my P96 pistol, which I always kept loaded and hidden in case of bandits. But as I looked, I saw Yakov's round, serious face looking in at me. I sighed, motioning for him to go around and get in. Because this was an old Japanese truck, it meant that the driver and passenger sides were switched from typical US or Russian convention, even though I still drove on the right side of the road. Yakov had a small leather sack with him that bulged with his few possessions. He sat down and looked over at me and gave me a faint smile. Let's go, he said. We have a very long ride. Indeed we did. At least 72 hours up to Yakutsk, where I would drop off the entire load of beer, and then a trip down to Magadan, which could take another 5 days. I then had to pick up another load in Magadan, a contract that I'd already accepted. They expected me there in 8 days, and I would have to drive perhaps 17 or 18 hours a day to make it in time. I set off slowly, the wind howling outside and the snow quickly covering the windshield. As I puttered down the paved road and towards the M56, Yakov told me a story. I used to be a driver on the M56 as well. One time, I had a load of vodka to transport to Yakutsk. It was summer. Dust blew so thickly across the road that I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. I was afraid that I would go off the road and flip the truck. Night had started to fall, so I pulled over on the side of the road and I fell asleep. I awoke to a tapping on the door. I looked up but no one stood there. I wondered if it was a trick. Bandits are known to rob truckers along these roads, as you know, and sometimes they even block the road with disabled vehicles to force the trucker to stop. Then they come out drunk and armed and steal whatever he's transporting. I nodded. I had heard so many stories. I had an old Makarov pistol. Must have been from the time of Stalin himself, he laughed. But I'll tell you, it was a good gun. As long as you cleaned it and take care of it, it would last a long time. Just like the AK-47, cheap and durable. I grabbed my gun and a flashlight and began to shine the light out the windows. The dust had greatly receded and now I could see at least 30 or 40 feet in every direction. To my amazement, I saw people working in the middle of the night, but they looked strange and ethereal. They dug at the road with their hands, using half-broken shovels and rocks and ancient, rusted wheelbarrows to move the dirt. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I was dreaming. I saw the identification sewn into the back of their jackets, a series of numbers that would replace that person's name, as they used to do in the gulags. I started my truck intending to get the heck out of there, and as soon as the engine made a noise, they all turned to look at me. They had woolen caps and thinly padded jackets with holes in their pants. None of them wore gloves. They shivered, trembling even though it was warm out at the time. And then I noticed the horrific wounds that each of them had. Many had gunshot wounds to the head, while others had crushed arms or hands. Each of them looked like a skeleton, starved nearly to death. They were all dead, they had to be. I drove forwards, hoping that they would move out of the way, but they didn't. Very slowly, I drove towards one of the men in the group, one whose face had been destroyed by a gunshot wound, turned into a mask of bone splinters. He just stared up at me as I approached. I kept moving forward slowly as I passed right through him. By the time that I had gotten a few dozen feet up, I turned around and saw that they were all gone. We had come onto the M56 by this point, and the whole truck vibrated horribly, shaking on the loose dirt and stones that comprised the road. I looked over at Yakov for a moment, wondering if he was pulling my leg. "Haven't you ever seen anything?" he asked me. "Well, I have, but not ghosts," I said. "Not the ghosts of Stalinism." I opened a fresh packet of cigarettes, taking one out and lighting it. I rolled down the window slightly. The bitterly cold wind began to whip into the truck, raising goosebumps all over my body. A cold wave of dread went down my spine, but for another reason, I didn't want to think of the story, and yet I told it anyway. It was winter, very cold just like now. I was driving down the M56 and found a car on the side of the road. Its hazards were on and its engine was not running. We never turn off our engines here in the winter because they won't start again in the freezing cold. Not at -60 or -70 with the wind chill. I instantly knew that the driver was in trouble. I pulled the truck over and got out. I examined the car and saw that the windows were smashed, shards of broken glass all over the seats and floor. And the driver's seat, it looked like it was covered in blood. And yet, no driver. I checked under the car and looked in the nearby forest, shining my flashlight through the trees. I called out for the driver, asking if he was hurt. For a long moment, no one answered me, and then I heard it. An answer, very faint, but with each of the words still recognizable. "Please," it said, "I'm hurt. Come deeper into the woods and help me." Its voice did not sound normal. At first I wondered if it was just the voice of an injured man, but it had a hissing quality, a low, gurgling tone. I tried to think fast and simply called out a question. "Did you get in a car crash?" I asked. "What happened?" The voice came back again after a few long seconds of silence, and it just said the same thing in the same identical cadence and speed, as if a recording played in the woods on repeat. At that point, I decided that I would leave immediately. Something felt wrong with the situation. I couldn't put my finger on it, but my intuition screamed at me that something didn't add up. I turned to go, and on the other side of the road I saw, well, something. I'm not sure what it was. It was like a man but hairless. Its skin shrunken and pale, totally bleached white against its bones. It looked starved, its knees knobby, its legs just consisting of bones wrapped with skin like white sticks. Standing there totally naked, without any sex organs, without eyebrows, its nose and ears missing. I wondered if it was a human at all. Now looking back on it, I know that it was not. Its eyes looked like shining orbs of pure blackness, huge pools of liquid black that stared at me, unblinking. And then it opened its mouth, showing many twisted and crooked yellow teeth. "Please, I'm hurt," it said, never changing its expression. It sounded like a recording, and I heard the same words behind me coming from the forest. "Please," another one said, maybe only 10 feet behind me from the sound. I ran towards my truck and I heard footsteps behind me, at least 2 pairs and maybe more. I didn't look back. I ran for my life and flung open the door. Just as I was closing it, a hand grabbed my leg. I shrieked, trying over and over again to close the door. I kept slamming against the thin, long white hand that had me. Eventually it let go, and I threw the truck into gear and got out of there. When I looked back, I saw dozens of pairs of black eyes staring at me, unblinking. After we had told our stories, I drove on in silence for an hour, only the soft pattering of snow against the truck breaking the monotony. I considered putting on some music but then decided against it. Yakov broke the silence after what felt like a very long time. "My grandfather died here, you know," he said. "The M56. He died building it. Sent to the gulags because one of his neighbors had a grudge against him over a land dispute. His neighbor went to the secret police and told them my grandfather was hoarding food, and it said that Stalin should be killed. Of course, none of that was true, but during those days, a grudge was good enough to guarantee you a death sentence. I remember them coming at night, 2 men in long black overcoats with bowler hats on their heads, fashionably angled to the left. They barely spoke. My grandfather answered the door. They said they had a few words for him, and then he was gone. I was in the kitchen with my grandmother, and by the time that I left, I only found an open door in the autumn night outside. I looked around, hoping to see my grandfather just smoking his pipe or sitting out on the porch, but I never saw him again. We never got his body back, and I only found out that he had died because of one of his fellow prisoners ended up surviving. He lived in the same town as me, and when he came back after 5 years in the gulags, he told me that my grandfather would never return. He told me that he had a message for me, that my grandfather loved me, he would always be with me, and that I should be strong. I cried for a long time. The townsman said my grandfather had collapsed one day while working in the winter, his body unable to deal with the constant sub-zero temperatures and starvation anymore. A guard came over and shot him dead in the head, and then they kept on building the road, throwing dirt and stones over his body. Soon the townsman said that he was buried under the road, next to a dozen other bodies that had died during work that day. I think maybe that's why the ghost had called out to me here. I never wanted to work as a driver on this road, but this is the only road leading north to Yakutsk, and I had very few other job options. Yet knowing that I drove over my grandfather's body every time that I drove the truck made me want to, I don't know, get revenge or even destroy the road itself. I just don't know. He stopped. My heart was racing and I wondered how much he knew about me. Strangely enough, my grandfather had also been in the gulags, but not as a prisoner. He had guarded them and likely shot them and tortured them as well, like all of the guards in that place. I never knew my grandfather, and he died of a heart attack before I was born. And yet I shared the same last name, and my parents even said that I looked just like him, with gray eyes, high cheekbones, and thick wavy black hair. I had a narrow and angular face and a thin muscular body, the same build as him as well. I was told that we could have been twins. I looked in the rearview mirror, seeing my own face and the face of my own grandfather, like another face glimpsed behind a mask. I saw headlights approaching behind us. At first, I thought nothing of it, assuming that it was just another driver on his way to deliver goods. But they drove far too fast for the conditions. With the snow, the rocks, and the unstable nature of the road itself, I felt a sense of unease at the dangerous speed at which the driver had approached. I changed the subject quickly, not wanting to talk about my family's past. "I think we're being followed," I said. Yakov spun his head, his eyes widening as he stared at the twin beams behind us. "They're going far too fast," he said, and then I saw it. Ahead of us was a totaled car, a rusted heap of metal without windows. The front driver's side looked smashed in as if it hit a tree or a large stone. The snow had already filled the interior, covering the seats and upholstery, and I barely saw it in time. I immediately started slowing down, knowing that a truck loaded with this much weight would take much longer than a usual car to stop. "Someone rolled this out here," I said. "I think this is an ambush." Just saying the words made my breath stop. I quickly tried to calculate our odds. I was grateful that I had Yakov and that he was armed. I reached under my seat and pulled out my pistol. "Do you have any weapons?" By now the headlights had gone from pinpricks to dull moon-like orbs in the snow, and I was rapidly slowing the truck so I wouldn't hit the car barricaded across the road, trying to keep moving so that I wouldn't slide off the road. Yakov quickly undid his bulging pack and reached through, looking for something and then frowning. And then he smiled, pulling his hand up and showing me a Makarov pistol. "I thought you said that you had a Makarov," I said. "Okay, whatever, I don't care." I looked closer at it. It was one of the oldest guns that I had ever seen, outside of a museum or a collection. The Makarov came to somewhat of a point near the barrel, narrowing in a curve at the end. It had a wooden hand grip, deeply worn by handling over the decades, and the metal had tarnished and turned a dark color. But as a whole, it still looked like a beautiful gun and an antique for sure. I wondered whether it actually fired. This gun from maybe 70 or 80 years ago. I hoped, for our sake, that it did. The lights had nearly reached us by now, and I had managed to stop the truck fully about 30 feet away from the barricaded car. It was the farthest away that I could manage under the conditions. I wanted room to back up or turn around or to accelerate and run over bandits if it came to that. I could probably smash the car out of the way of my truck if it were life or death. At least, so I hoped at the time. Looking back now, all these years later, I realize how naive I was at that moment. I saw a man approaching out of the woods, hooded and covered from head to toe in black. Each had guns. The truck behind us had stopped. I saw a Toyota pickup truck extremely old and rusted. I saw that it had 3 sets of tires, 2 in the back, a dually. It looked modified as many cars in Russia are. Yet with 6 tires and no load to carry, it could move across the M56 at a speed greater than my own. I certainly could not run it unless I shot 1 or 2 of the tires out and slowed them down enough for me to find help. This area was deserted, but there were very small towns of nomads or natives in the region. 4 men got out of the pickup truck, each carrying a rifle. We were hopelessly outmatched here. I wondered if we would die. I doubted it, but really, what did I know about bandits? Perhaps our bones would simply join the hundreds of thousands of others who had died here. Perhaps they too would become a part of the road. "Get out!" The man in front screamed at us. Covered in a ski mask, I could only see his eyes, but they looked bleary and unfocused. His gaze kept flickering from us to the woods, and then around the area, and then returned back to me. I wondered if these men were all drunk. Very likely. If so, it may be easier to fight them off. I looked over at Yakov, who sat in his seat, trembling slightly, the gun in his hand. He looked at me, and I could see the terror that I felt reflected in his eyes. "Should we fight?" he asked desperately. I had no idea. This had never happened before. I had only heard stories, but... "Get out now or we shoot." The man screamed at us, breaking my thoughts. "Yes, we must fight," I said softly, as if the man outside could hear me. "They might kill us anyway. I'm not taking that chance. At least if we fight, we might be able to keep our fates in our hands alone. These men are likely drunk and not very accurate with their guns. We might have the advantage there." I looked over at the man in front, seeing him raise his gun and aim it at me. I ducked down, and a minute later, a bullet flew through the driver's side door. The crack of it shattered the otherwise muffled sounds of the blizzard. I felt cold air rush into the car through the hole. I rolled down my window while still ducking down on my seat, praying to God for help. I saw Yakov duck down as well, shaking like a leaf, his hands trembling badly. I sat up quickly, aiming and firing at the man in front. He stood there, his gun pointed down, talking to the other man. The shot hit him in the chest and he dropped, screaming. I saw splatters of blood and the pure white snow around him, little islands of red and an eternally white landscape. Shooting a gun in such a confined space made my ears ring, and for a moment I couldn't hear anything. I saw that the rest of the men had met in a circle when I shot him, both the ones from the forest and the ones from the pickup truck. It would make it easier to pick them all off one by one, or so I hoped anyway. I counted 7 more men to kill or disable, yet I hoped that if I killed a few, the rest would flee. They wanted easy targets and quick money, not men with guns who shot back. They all raised their guns to fire into the truck, swearing at us and yelling for us to surrender or die, when a shrill, ear-splitting sound suddenly came out of the forest. They looked away, their guns still pointed at us, their fingers on the triggers. I heard them babbling to each other in panicked, low voices, and they all began to run in unison back towards their pickup truck. They didn't even give us a backwards glance, or try to grab the body of their fallen comrade. They ran for their lives as if they had heard that sound before and they knew exactly what it was. I had no idea, however. I thought some strange Siberian animal would come flying out of the woods, some species that I had never seen before. But this seemed far better than a group of armed men. "Oh, thank God," I said. "They're leaving. Now we just need to push this car out of the road and we can get the heck out of here." Yakov nodded, still looking nervous and still holding his gun tightly. "What do you think that was?" he asked. I shrugged, apathetic. Probably just an animal," I said. "These people around here, they're superstitious. They think the boogeyman is." But at that moment I saw not a monster, but a child fleeing out of the woods. It was a little Siberian girl no more than 7 or 8. Her facial features a mixture of Asian and white, reminding me of the Buryats that I had known, an ethnic minority in the region. She had a look of pure and utter terror on her face that told me that this was no animal chasing her. I quickly opened my door, running out into the freezing winter. Because this was a Japanese truck, the driver's side was on the right, making me closer to her than Yakov. "Little girl," I said, "what are you doing out here in the middle of nowhere? You'll freeze to death. Were you with those men? Are they your family? Did they kidnap you?" She looked shell-shocked, her eyes widening as she saw me. "I was kidnapped, yes," she said, "but not by any man, Please, sir, get me out of here. My twin sister is still back at the hut. She needs help. That thing is going to eat her." And then she put her face against my chest and cried, "It was the Baba Yaga. She's real, please. I don't want to be eaten." I grabbed the hysterical, screaming girl by the hand and began to pull her towards the truck. At first she hesitated, and then she began to run ahead of me, flinging herself into the cab and looking back out with huge dark eyes, like a gopher peeking out of its hole. That shrill, hateful shrieking from the woods had nearly reached me by this point. I couldn't make out any words in it. It seemed like just guttural cries of fury and hunger. I began to back up towards the truck, my pistol still raised, refusing to turn my back on anything that sounded like that. And then I saw the silhouette, breaking through the trees. At first, I thought it was a polar bear, this looming shadow that snapped solid branches aside like they were twigs. But instead I saw a woman standing over 8 feet tall, with mottled gray skin and a wrinkled, gaunt face. One of her eyes looked pure white as if covered in a cataract. Her other had a strikingly pure blue iris, with a deep, large pupil staring out from the middle, roving over the landscape before focusing on me. Her nose stuck out like a beak, sharp and curving, a few inches long. On her neck I saw a necklace, holding the fingers of children, dozens of them, some rotted to bones, others fresh and still dripping blood. She saw me, looked at the gun and then at my face and smiled. "You don't need to die too, friend," she said in a sickly, choking voice. A trickle of blood coming from her mouth and rolling down her chin as she spoke. "Give me the girl and you can leave in peace. What's mine is mine." I didn't even respond but simply fired, aiming at her chest. She fell back, screaming again, and I turned and ran towards the truck, slamming the door and starting the engine. The pickup truck had gone, and I couldn't even see its lights in the distance anymore. I started to go forward, slowly pushing the car aside with my truck, yet I couldn't get it to budge more than a few inches, as it seemed to sink down into the snow. I tried reversing, but I couldn't get the momentum on the slippery ice, as the road sloped downwards at an angle towards the right side. I didn't have enough clearance to try going forwards either. I was stuck, and to make things worse, I looked outside the window and saw the Baba Yaga was gone. Only a small puddle of black blood marked the spot where she had lain. While conditions seemed bad right now with the truck stuck like it was, I gave thanks that at least the engine started without issue. At times it got so cold in Siberia that the engines would fail to start. The temperature had started to increase, however, and outside the wind had died down. The snow had stopped, and looking at the thermometer that I kept on the outside of the truck, I saw that it was only -5 degrees Fahrenheit now. I cursed, putting on many layers while I sat in the truck driver's seat, the little girl sitting between me and Yakov on an empty bucket that she had turned upside down. She didn't seem affected by the cold at all. She had probably grown up in far worse. "What are you doing?" the girl said with widening eyes, watching me. I looked at her, shaking my head. "Obviously, we have to go get your sister," I said. "No," she said. "I'm not going back there, never. I will never go back to that place." She started to cry. "The legs, the fence, the ovens, the cages. You have no idea how horrible it is." "Calm down," I said. "You have to lead us back towards the hut. You probably won't have to go in. We just need to get your sister and come back, and then we can leave." "What's your name?" "Irina," she said. "That's a very pretty name," Yakov said. "My name is Yakov and this is Nikolai. We're the good guys. We can fight off that witch and bring your sister home. If we do nothing, your sister will die. You know that." Irina nodded, wiping her eyes. Bundled up in her layers of clothing with a fur jacket on the outside, she looked almost like a little Eskimo sitting here in my truck. I repressed the crazy urge to laugh at the image, remembering what was happening. "Let's do this," I said, getting out of the truck. I grabbed more ammo from the glove box and saw Yakov grabbing some bullets from the satchel of random goods that he carried around with him in a leather skin. He left the rest of his possessions in the truck, folding the leather carefully back over them and tying it with a cord. It felt eerie, like the dawn before a major battle. I had goosebumps all over my body and not just from the cold. The idea of going up against an infamous witch, a child-eating monster, well, it didn't raise my confidence. Though this happened years ago, I still remember that terrible feeling, as if everything had been leading up to this point and now everything stood still watching. I had heard legends of Baba Yaga growing up, how Satan had taken 12 women who were murderers and criminals, thrown their bodies in a pot together, mixed it up, and came out Baba Yaga. Of course, I scoffed at such myths now that I was older, but seeing her there had made me question many things. Irina went out first, not minding the cold at all, her breath coming out in steamy plumes. Yakov and I had flashlights from the truck jumping down behind her. Their light came out dimly, but it gave enough illumination on the white snow to see. The clouds had started to part and the moon had come out in the sky, looking down on us like a single blind eye, like the cataract-ridden eye of Baba Yaga that I had seen before. As we started walking across the M56 and into the woods, that shrill gurgling shriek came ringing out again. I knew Baba Yaga was close, likely even watching us. She might attack at any moment. We walked further down the trail, a winding deer trail only a couple of feet wide, with branches that would smack me in the face and rocks to trip over every few steps. Just as I had turned to Yakov to say that we may have lost her, she attacked. I saw a blur and then an intense pain in my side as she tackled me, knocking me quickly to the snowy ground. I kept a death grip on my gun, smacking my head against a tree trunk, and the world went white. I drifted in and out of consciousness for a few moments, or perhaps it was longer. Time got strange. As if from a great distance, I heard gunshots and more screaming, and then my vision started to return and I focused. I saw Yakov crouched on the ground, holding his left hand tightly. I saw a fountain of blood running over his gloves, staining the snow in strange droplets and splotches. I tried to sit up, but a lightning bolt of pain seared my back. I groaned, raising my hand to my head. I felt something sticky on my scalp, and pulling my hand back, I saw that it was covered in blood. It felt warm and wet, running down from the right side of my scalp and showing no signs of slowing. I felt nauseated and weak for a second, seeing all that blood, how it stained my clothes and the snow below me. I took a few deep breaths in and out, slowly concentrating and steadying myself. My hand still trembled, and my legs felt like jelly as I tried to stand, but I leaned against the tree and let the waves of weakness and nausea pass by. Yakov wasn't doing much better. He was hyperventilating, staring in shock at his spurting hand. His left thumb looked like it was mostly or entirely gone. We've got to put pressure," I said, slowly gulping air, "on the wound, and ice and snow." I began to tear a strip from one of my shirts and then walked slowly over to Yakov on unsteady legs. I looked into his eyes. They looked dark and tortured, and he quickly looked away, tears forming in his eyes from the shock and pain. Irina sat next to him on a log, and she watched in horror, looking away whenever she noticed the blood. "Let's do this," I said. "Ready?" He nodded weakly. I pulled the strip of cloth around the hole where his thumb used to, running it around his hand in circles and tightening it. He screamed. I gave him a piece of wood to bite down on, and he pulled it even tighter. I saw teeth marks forming deep in the wood. A solid branch 1 inch in diameter I had snapped in half. His breath came in and out so fast that I thought for sure he would pass out, but he kept with me. Soon I had pressure on the wound and the bleeding had slowed considerably. I repeated the process with my head, wrapping more strips of cloth around the bloody scalp wound and pulling. I gritted my teeth, but the pain wasn't nearly as bad as I thought, except for the crushing migraine. More than anything, I just felt weak and waves of nausea kept assailing me. Splotches would rise in my vision, black dots that seemed to precede passing out. But I would sit down quickly, and after a few minutes, I had regained most of my strength. "Let's keep going," I said weakly. Irina stood next to Yakov, looking petrified. "I don't want to go," Irina said stubbornly. "Please don't make me." "Irina," I sighed, "your sister might die if we turn around. We have no choice." "But I'm too scared," she said. "You have no idea how bad it is there. You can't even imagine." But after a few minutes of convincing, she continued to lead us. A ragtag group of injured men and a child, limping through the thick snow in the freezing cold. We walked for an hour in silence, the little girl following her tracks, looking for landmarks that she had passed when she had escaped the first time. She had grown up in the woods most likely, and her family must have taught her much. I was worried about freezing to death, but then I started to notice that my body was growing warmer. I thought perhaps it was simply the first sign of hypothermia. And yet as she walked, I noticed changes in the forest. It had actually gotten warmer. It wasn't just in my mind. Soon the snow had all gone. I looked around and noticed that all the trees were dead, their naked arms extending up to the sky. I had to take off a jacket and then a sweater too. I saw the others doing the same, sweating as it warmed up. A fog began to roll in, covering the whole area. "This is the space between the world of the living and the dead," Irina said in her sweet child's voice. It made the statement all the more horrible. "The hut is nearby. This is the border of her home." Through the mist, I swore that I could see faces appearing and disappearing, the horror-stricken visages of children and eternally grinning skulls. Soon we came to a clearing. All the trees had stopped in a large circle, a few 100 feet in diameter. In horror, I looked at what lay beyond. A fence surrounded the property made of children's bones. It extended high up at least 20 feet, countless arm and leg bones stacked on top of each other, bound together with twine and braced with more bones, attached vertically against the others. I saw no gaps bigger than an inch and no way to climb it. Looking at the top, I saw pieces of sharpened bone sticking up, like some razor wire from hell. Irina shook at my side and she grabbed my hand suddenly, her small body exuding a strength that seemed beyond her physical abilities. I smiled down at her, smoothing her long black hair with my right hand. I felt almost entirely recovered from my earlier concussion, though my head still pounded in time with the beat of my heart. I wished that I had brought some aspirin. "How do we get in?" Irina asked, taking off another sweater and hanging it over her shoulder. I had absolutely no idea. "Let's look around," I said. We began to circle the fence, walking along the circumference of the clearing. I could see a hut beyond through the small gaps. After a minute, we came to the gate and it stood 20 feet tall, like the rest of the fence, and it would be almost impossible to scale. Unlike the rest of the fence, the gate had been fashioned entirely from skulls. I saw all the small skulls stacked on top of another. As I imagined how many children had died to build just this macabre gate, a feeling of sickness and dread washed over me. Sticking out the front of it in the exact center, I saw a larger skull. It looked like that of a man. In its open mouth, I saw a silver keyhole. In anger, I tried shaking the gate, and it came swinging open, totally silent. "It's open," Yakov said, amazed. I looked at him. "This feels like a trap," I said. He nodded. Irina hid behind Yakov now, not wanting to look at the eternally grinning skulls stacked in front of her, bound together with some sort of invisible glue. I looked through the gate at the hut beyond, my breath caught in my throat. It stood on two massive legs. The feet looked like those of a chicken, but the legs loomed 10 feet above the ground, where they somehow attached to the hut, holding it up suspended in the air. They were skeletal, all the flesh and muscle long ago wasted away. "Are those chicken legs?" Yakov asked, his voice low. I felt eyes on me. I looked back into the forest, but I saw no one. "Who the heck knows?" I asked. "But where do you get a chicken that's the size of an elephant, or even bigger?" "From hell?" he asked, and I laughed. "You think they have massive chickens down there just going around and pecking at all the hell grains," I said. He smiled. "I don't know, and I don't want to find out. Let's do this." We began to walk forwards into the clearing. I could see the circular hut more clearly now. An inner light burned, sending out a fiery red glow through the windows. Unlike the rest of this horrible place, it looked like the hut was actually built of wood and stone. It had a quaint look, like the hut of an ancient serf. The top of it met in a point with thatch and twigs carefully aligned to form a rounded dome. The windows were lined with stones. Trunks of dead trees formed the main construction material, pressed one against the next and stacked vertically in a perfect circle. They had their branches cut off and their bark stripped, the wood ground down to a smooth and uniform texture. "My sister is in there," Irina whispered. "Please don't make me go back. Please, you don't know what they do in there, what she does in there." I grabbed her hand. "We can't leave you behind. I think we're being watched. I'm sorry, but you have to come with us." She put her head down, looking like a beaten dog. She trudged alongside us slowly as we examined the property, but we saw no sign of anyone. I sighed deeply. "All right, let's go inside," I said. "Let's find out what horrors await us in that hut." As we walked forward, I heard the gate click close behind us. I turned and looked, but I saw no one. It seemed as if it had closed on its own. I saw to my horror that I would need a key to get out as well as in. Another skull, its mouth open and filled with a silver locking mechanism, stuck out on this side as well. The metal in its mouth made it look like it was choking, the eternally gaping mouth like it was screaming. I turned away, focusing on the task at hand, hoping I would survive the next few minutes. The space around the hut looked totally dead. I didn't see a single blade of grass or even a weed to mar the smooth, black earth. It looked so dark in the shadows of the forest that the legs in the hut seemed to hover over an abyss. The door, painted a blinding white, contrasted heavily with the rest of the stocked logs and twigs that composed the ancient-looking hut. A set of rickety wooden stairs led up to the door. I went first, and there was no railing, and with each step I took, I was afraid that it would fall right through the stairs. But they were stronger than they looked and nailed tightly to the beams underneath. Without hesitation, I flung the door open and saw a nightmare laying beyond. A child's body roasted on a spit over the raging fire in the fireplace, giving off a smell of cooking meat and wood smoke that mixed with the rosemary, parsley, and other herbs sprinkled over the body. I saw lampshades made of human skins, covering black candles that flickered and sputtered as the wind came in from outside. In the corner, a little girl crouched in a cage that was only big enough for a dog. She couldn't stand up and cried constantly. When she saw me, her eyes widened. "Please help me," she screamed. "She'll be back any moment. Get me out of here." She looked like the spitting image of Irina, and I wondered if they were identical twins. Yakov grabbed a knife from his pocket, going over to the cage and looked closely at the lock. He flicked it open and began feverishly pulling at the ancient-looking padlock that held the cage closed. It didn't seem nearly as secure as a modern deadbolt, and I wondered how many years the old witch had possessed it. I walked over to the window and looked outside, and my heart jumped in my throat. Outside, I saw Baba Yaga getting out of what looked like a flying pestle as it slowly lowered itself toward the ground. It stood about 4 feet tall, enough to hide Irina inside it if it came to it. The wood looked beautiful, like smooth mahogany, perfectly fit together without cracks or gaps of any kind. It had strange runes burnt into the exterior. The writing was not Russian or any Slavic language that I knew. She had a mortar as tall as herself. She had her hands wrapped around the dark wood of the mortar, using the flaring wide end of the bottom to push herself up and over the wall of the pestle. She had extremely thin legs like those of a skeleton. They looked like 2 iron bars wrapped in skin. I looked close through the window, squinting to try to make out every detail. I wondered if she used that mortar and pestle to grind up the bodies of children, to prepare their bodies for a meal. I saw dark stains on the bottom of the mortar, dark red and soaked deeply into the wood. I figured that answered my question. She put the mortar back inside and then turned and looked directly inside the hut. Her eyes met mine, one blind and staring, one filled with intelligence and fury. I ducked away, hoping that she hadn't seen me. Hurry up, I said, turning to go help Irina and Yakov. She's coming, she's got a flying barrel too. I saw they nearly had the lock broken by this point. It was fairly flimsy and ancient looking, and Yakov had a folding knife which he used to pry it loose. Realizing there was nothing that I could do to speed up the process, I ran back towards the window. Baba Yaga was gone. She wasn't standing next to her mortar and pestle anymore. In fact, her mortar and pestle were gone too. A moment later, a deafening cacophony exploded across the hut as the roof collapsed inwards, covering us with thin branches, thatch, and straw. I found myself on the floor, unable to remember where I was for a moment. The cold steel of the gun was still gripped tightly in my hand, and then I heard crying and screaming, and it all came rushing back to me. I pushed some boards off of myself, feeling blood run down over my forehead. I felt weak. The fireplace on the other side of the room gave off some light. I saw the ceiling had collapsed, and as I looked up, I saw the full moon illuminating the cracked and ragged edges of the ruined roof. A gunshot rang out very close by, and I heard a guttural cry of pain and surprise. I ran towards the sound, and after pushing a few beams from a section of collapsed wall to the side, I made a path towards Yakov and Baba Yaga. Yakov stood only a few feet away and had just shot her in the neck at point-blank range. Thick black blood ran down her tattered rags of clothing, staining the coarse brown cloth and making it cling to her skin. She screamed in rage, opening her mouth wide and showing many sharp yellow teeth, running forwards towards him and tackling him. I pushed some more rubble out of the way and ran forwards, the gun still clenched in my hand. Baba Yaga used her shark-like teeth to bite Yakov over and over in a space of mere seconds. He squealed like a pig being slaughtered, an inhuman wail that made me want to cover my ears and look away. Without thinking, I raised the gun and fired. The shot hit her in the shoulder and came out of her chest. With a grunt, she fell sideways onto the ruined floor. I saw with horror that the wound in her neck was stitching itself closed before my eyes. Whatever dark magic had made this creature had clearly given her superhuman healing abilities. I wondered how we should kill her. If possible, whether multiple gunshots to the head would do it or not. I had a creeping suspicion that it would not be so easy. I saw Yakov writhing on the floor, his face a mess of torn flesh, his nose missing and pieces of his cheeks, lips, and forehead had deep slices, leaving flaps of skin hanging over his face. I started to run to him, but he shook his head vigorously. "Get the girls," he said through a mouth full of blood, choking, his sounds coming out strange, maybe due to the bites that had split his lips and taken part of the top one. Instead, I began to walk over to Baba Yaga, planning to put the pistol to her head point blank and pull the trigger. But the ruins of the thick hut door creaked open at that moment, and I turned, stunned at what I saw. Across the pile of torn beams and splintered boards, I saw the creatures that I had told Yakov about, the ones that I had seen next to the empty car stained with blood. They had hidden in the woods saying, "Please help me," over and over in a perfect, parrot-like fashion. And now they had come, the same pure black eyes, thin bodies and sheet white skin. They looked like cancer patients, without a shred of fat on their bodies, totally hairless and alien, lacking sex organs or nipples, ears or noses. But they were much faster than their emaciated condition would suggest, and they began to rush in, pushing some of the rubble aside and approaching where Yakov and I stood. I looked from Baba Yaga to the newcomers quickly, my mind racing. She looked up, a sensation of pain in her one good eye, the other flat and white, but her face lit up when she saw who had just arrived. "My servants, my sweet children," she said in a deep and cooing voice. "You knew your mother was in trouble and came, didn't you? You always know, always. That makes you so beautiful to me. You'll always be mine." I turned back to Baba Yaga, meaning to finish her off, but she sat up rapidly and grabbed my wrist, twisting. I cried out in pain and the gun went flying, settling under debris and rubble. I smelled smoke and to my horror, realized the fireplace had ignited some of the ruined beams. Baba Yaga pushed me back and went flying into the wall, my wrist swelling and burning. In the corner I saw Irina helping her sister out of the cage. The fire caught the old brittle wood as if it were soaked in gasoline, and I saw with horror that soon it would cut off the escape route for Irina and her sister. Groaning, I got up quickly. Yakov had reloaded and began shooting at the creatures that approached him. Baba Yaga stood up slowly, still dripping black blood on the floor, looking much weaker than before. I counted that as a blessing, though I didn't think that it would last. Whatever dark magic kept this monster alive was more powerful than a flesh wound, apparently. I had to choose between helping Irina or getting the gun, and I saw no choice. I dived into the rubble where I had last seen it, feeling splinters and nails poking into my skin. A few pierced my arms and legs through my clothing, and I felt sticky trickles of blood soaking them. I ignored the pain of my hand, the throbbing migraine that I still had from the concussion, and now this new insult to my body. The adrenaline helped, but I knew that if I survived this, I would be sore and cut for weeks. The black-eyed creatures ran at me, and one grabbed my leg as I ducked and felt around furiously in the dark for the pistol. The fire kept spreading, giving me slightly more light through the crooked beams and collapsed roof, and I saw a glint of metal in the dim illumination, just as the creatures had pulled me out. I grabbed frantically, feeling the cold grip of the gun against my hand. Turning around quickly, I fired without aiming, shooting point blank at the creatures standing there. One got hit in the chest, a splatter of the same black blood as Baba Yaga's staining the wall behind it. I missed the other one, and it lunged, snapping with its twisted yellow teeth, going straight for my throat or face. Without thinking, I fired again, and the shot went through its nose holes, disintegrating the front of its face, and sending a dark spray of blood out behind it. It fell on me. I struggled, pushing the body off. All I could smell was smoke now, and I began to choke and sputter. I looked around wildly, but the smoke had grown thick, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I looked for Irina and her sister moving towards where I had last seen them, but quickly gave up and started calling out. "Irina, get out of here now, we have to go," I said. I felt a small hand thrust into mine, and thinking that it was Irina, I pulled, running towards the door. I ran straight into Yakov, who was choking on the smoke. I looked into his eyes and gasped. His face was a mask of blood. Only 2 dark eyes peered out from the destroyed flesh below. He kept spitting blood as he coughed. Without thinking, I pushed him towards the door, continuously pulling the little girl behind me. More creatures stood there, but we shot the ones on the stairs and the others retreated away, galloping on all 4s like some strange animal. They looked back with hatred, their eyes black and shining. They ran towards the gate, which was now open. I wondered if one of them had a key. Turning around, I saw the hut had turned into a blazing inferno. To my horror, I saw that I did not hold Irina's hand, but her twin sister's instead. "Where's Irina?" I asked, panicked, and then the screaming started from the hut. The floor began to collapse, chunks of molten wood falling between the dead skeletal chicken legs that held up the hut. Like something from a nightmare, I saw Baba Yaga stumbling out, her skin melting, her hair on fire, her one good eye still peering out from the mask of burning flesh. Her shrill, ear-splitting shriek echoed through the forest around us, and I heard another quieter scream start coming from the hut. It sounded like a little girl. Without thinking, I began to push Yakov and Irina's sister out of the gate, praying for Irina's safety, but knowing that the only thing she could hope for was a quick death from suffocation. No one could survive that inferno. She was right when she said that we shouldn't have come here, but I had forced her and now she was dying or dead. She ran out into the woods, following the trail back to the truck. Yakov kept stumbling and falling. "I can't go on much longer," he said. "I think I'm dying. She really did a number on me. I feel lightheaded and I think that I might pass out soon." "That's just the blood loss," I said, reassuring him but not believing it. "Once we get you to a hospital, you'll be fine. You just need a few stitches. It's not as bad as it looks." He laughed, a sarcastic and bitter sound. "Don't lie to the dying," he muttered. And just as the truck came into sight, the black-eyed creatures came galloping silently out of the woods on all 4s, a dozen of them surrounding us. They didn't blink or show any emotion, but as if a signal had been given, they swarmed us all at once. I began shooting, having refilled the chamber with bullets from my pocket, but there were too many. I cleared a path towards the truck, shooting 5 in the chest and aiming for center mass. Yakov began to fire, but many of his shots missed as blood streamed over his face and eyes, and soon we were both out of bullets. I grabbed the little girl and ran towards the truck as Yakov held his place, roaring with bloodlust and excitement, pulling out a folding knife from his pocket. "Come on," he screamed, but he just smiled. "Goodbye, friend," he said as the creatures jumped on him, and he began stabbing and fighting in his last moments, cutting at their throats and faces as they ate him alive. I took Irina's sister to a hospital and told the police about everything that had happened. They looked at me like I was a madman. The little girl corroborated my story, but they just dismissed it as the imagination of a child. Nonetheless, they went out to the site and they found Yakov's body. They ruled that he had been mauled by animals. There were, after all, many bears in that area. They also followed our footsteps into the woods but said they found no hut, no fire, and no clearing. They said the footsteps just stopped suddenly, as if we had been abducted by a UFO. The hut had gone and so had Baba Yaga. After that day, I finished my drive, sold my truck, and made plans to move out of Russia forever. I had seen enough. But still, I wonder what else lies in those woods. What other secrets remain to be found? My name is Artem Avilov. I never thought that I was going to reveal any of this to anybody who didn't already know. In 1962, a major event occurred in the Nenets province of Russia. You wouldn't have heard about it though, as everything about it was covered up. It was an event I decided that I would reveal to the public on my deathbed to escape the consequences of talking about it outside of the group of those in the know. There's no need for me to summarize it for you, as I've kept a journal in which I documented everything that happened during those odd months. I have transcribed the relevant part of the journal for all of you to read. I should mention that I have nothing against anyone's religious beliefs. Just don't hurt people because they don't believe what you believe. If they have to defend themselves, they will. With nothing more to say, here it goes. Entry 1. It's September 29th, 1962. I'm with a team of 6, currently en route to an area southwest of Kullerden, where we will be conducting one of the most significant experiments since the Great Patriotic War. Our commander has been planning this out very carefully for months, and we aren't going to mess it up. Entry 2. It's around 5 p.m. and we're at a station in an area surrounded by trees. There's some snowfall and I've been shivering even in the 2 layers of clothing. The experiment begins in 5 minutes. Let's see how far we get. Honestly, I'm kind of nervous. Opening portals is a huge deal considering we don't know where they will take us. I wonder if America's doing the same experiments right now. If they are, hopefully we're ahead of them. Entry 3. We've done it. When Abramov flipped the switch, both machines buzzed and then a light appeared between them. The light appeared as if the air was paper and the light itself was a hole. The portal's open right now. This isn't like anything that I've ever seen. Entry 4. Our investigator Galkin stepped slowly into the portal. After about 10 seconds, he stepped back out and described what he saw. Green forests, dark objects gliding through the air, and then I heard sirens, but I came back before I could see anything more. Before we could ask any more questions, a fleeting presence filled the air. I glanced at the portal. A white mist was floating out. It was shiny and transparent. I traded looks with the others who couldn't stop looking at the figure. The presence emanating from the figure became crushingly strong. Our commander ordered for the portal to close. He flipped the switch and then the portal shrunk immediately, closing on the mist which fell to the snow. The presence lifted in the mist, writhing around in the snow, slowed down to a stop. Its shininess had dissipated. Its white color changed to gray. Entry 5. We did not know what the mist was supposed to be in the context of its reality. Even with Galkin's description, sirens, black objects hovering in the sky. Generally speaking, it sounded like what Galkin witnessed was a reaction to a disturbance of an unknown magnitude. We asked him if he saw any markings anywhere. He told us that he saw none. No tanks, no choppers, nothing. We asked him to go into detail about the black objects. Before he could answer, a bright light appeared in the spot the portal had closed. It expanded, taking the same appearance as the portal. For some reason, the portal had reopened and it wasn't us. As we watched with looks of confusion, a dark creature hovered out of the portal. The appearance of this thing sent chills down my spine. It was a multitude of rotating rings covered with eyes. The eyes had a sinister glare and the thing itself made this wet, growling sound. It was atrocious. I could feel the chills from looking at this thing despite freezing in the cold air. I glanced at our commander. He had a look of disgust on his face, a look that turned into one of fear. He took out a pistol and opened fire on the creature, but it didn't stress. It just kept hovering. I couldn't help but take out my own pistol and fire at the thing myself. That didn't do anything either, but hopefully it was sending a message though. Eventually, the creature hovered back into the portal. I knew that we should have expected this. We had just discovered an alternate world in which presumably, whatever creatures we saw were normal. Abramov flipped the switch, but the portal refused to close. He flipped it again and it wasn't closing. And then something else stepped out of the portal. This time, it was a being who looked like a middle-aged human man. The only thing was, he had a red glow, an aura. I then noticed the otherworldly look of murderous rage in his eyes, a look that sent chills down my spine. He stood in front of us and began to speak in a soft tone. "Gentlemen, I'm speaking in a language that you can understand so I can be as clear as possible. I don't know who you are, and neither does the Ophanim we sent. But you guys need to know that you have just triggered a mountain of chaos. We don't recognize you either," said our commander. "But we do know you're not recognized as something that exists in our world. You're an anomaly." "Oh, is that so?" asked the man. "I can't get any information from your spirits for some reason, so I'll ask. Was what you just did an accident?" "Pardon me?" asked our commander. "You know what you did. You know what happened when you shut this portal." "Oh no," said our commander. "There was an unknown and uncertain misty figure seeping into our world. We had to close the portal." "Interesting," said the man. "I mean, I'm just curious. No matter what though, we're going to take measures into our own hands." "What are you trying to say?" asked our commander. "You killed Yahweh," said the man. "That should say enough, and I'll be back with the others soon. So prepare yourselves. This war will be a short one." The man stepped back into the portal. Once he was gone, the portal had closed by itself. When he said Yahweh, the first thing that I thought of was Yahweh from biblical literature. He even mentioned an Ophanim, which I'm sure I've heard a priest talk about some time ago. The people in that parallel world used the naming conventions of the Bible. What did he mean by Yahweh then? I asked the others. And Galkin brought up the Ophanim, telling us that he had some Christians talk about it before. According to Galkin, the way the Christians described it sounded a lot like that floating, rotating ring creature that we had just seen. I took it as coincidence. I wasn't ready to believe that we had actually killed God. That idea sounded unfathomable, crazy. The inhabitants of the alternate world probably just so happened to be named as such and such. Galkin walked up to the transparent gray substance that was supposedly the corpse of some being called Yahweh, and he bent down to get a closer look. Entry 6. We took the substance to a lab and ran some tests on it. Once we got the results, we were shocked. We could determine the substance was made of a material that we had not only never seen before, but have also never discovered before. Entry 7. We've been conducting experiments for the past few days. Further experimentation on the mystery material that has led us to finding out how to destroy the material. This discovery is huge because if we did kill a mystical being, and we were about to fight a war against its comrades, we were in dire need of weapons that could give us the upper hand. I'm filled with dread thinking about being overpowered by unknown entities, especially that rotating bunch of wheels. I'm going to assist in the construction of guns and bombs made for destroying those otherworldly things, and I won't stop working until the weapons are ready for use. Entry 8. And the weapons are ready. Backups have been assembled in case we need them. Now we wait for our preparation time to run out. When the glowing man returns, we will be ready. The top Soviet commanders have been covertly readying the Red Army for war in an operation called Fighting Angels. The only thing that I'm worried about, however, is that we don't know what those beings have in their arsenal. Hopefully our weapons are strong enough to at least incapacitate them. Entry 9. This was a complete surprise. I woke up at 3 in the morning to the shouts of my comrades. One of them barged into my room and told me to hurry. "They've arrived, the war has begun, all their men glow." This was it. I made sure that I had the needed artillery with me. As I anticipated the defense, I could hear gunshots and sonic booms echoing from some distance away. As I sprinted out the door, all I could see were flashes of red and white lights off in the distance. It was freezing, but my blood was boiling with eagerness, adrenaline, and dread. On my way to the scene, a soldier running a few feet ahead of me combusted into a white light. My adrenaline spiked. I ducked behind a nearby bush and poked my head up to look for any glowing men. One was headed my way, shrouded in a deep red glow that emphasized its face. It had a deep look of anger and determination. I aimed and opened fire. The glowing man was torn to shreds, vanishing into the night. The guns worked, but did we have enough ammunition? To avoid anybody coming close to finding out about the war and the outcome of our experiments, our commanders decided that we would be receiving news via word of mouth, rather than through radio communication. Code phrases were to be used otherwise. Deaths would be covered up as well. Any dead soldiers were going to be cremated and then honored in secret at a later date. Nothing about the war was allowed to be recorded or broadcasted, and every civilian in Ninets who were aware of the war was to be sworn to secrecy. Our commanders were really doing the best they could to cover this up. Day one was full of uncertainty. The glowing men were everywhere. Every other minute there would be one or two of them running along the trail. It was odd seeing them be torn up by our new bullets. It was something out of a dream. I only got the opportunity to sleep every once in a while. Even despite attempting to sleep in an underground cellar, I was too busy trying to control my breathing. At times I would nearly fall asleep, but then I would hear the sound of leaves being rustled and I would be wide awake again. That all kept going on for 3 weeks before things began to slow down. The glowing men began arriving in smaller groups, and their faces were becoming more and more vengeful. Still, I could only duck and hope for the best, killing these dreadful creatures from another world before they could kill me. Entry 10. It's week 3, day 5. I finally received some news. A soldier walked up to me with a look of exhaustion on his face. The glowing men are cornered. Our men are guarding the portal. They're shooting each and every glowing being that comes through. Entry 11. Week 4, day 1. I awoke at 4 to a strange wet growl. I grabbed my gun and tiptoed to a spot beside the window. The growling was giving me chills. As it went on, I peeked out the window and my heart sank when I saw it floating underneath the light emanating from a lamppost. The wheels, the floating, rotating wheels covered with eyes. It was just hovering in one spot. It shined in the light, but it was still ugly and monstrous. I aimed and fired at the thing, shattering my window in the process. The bullet hit the creature, but all that came of that was a white steam that started to float towards me. When the steam cleared, the creature started moving towards me. Its silhouette and speed, it made my stomach turn. I fired at it again and hid behind the wall to get out of the view of the window. White steam seeped in through the shattered window. I took deep breaths in an attempt to calm my adrenaline. It was almost pitch dark, but I noticed the wheeled creature's dark silhouette as it floated in. It was only slightly darker than the night. I fired at it again. It stopped, but I couldn't tell if I had done any damage to it. My door squeaked open. A flash of light illuminated the face of the person entering. It was a man, a soldier, my brother. I watched as he combusted into a human-sized white flame which itself illuminated the entire room, including the wheel creature. It had a few bloody holes and an unmoving wheel. My heart dropped a second time. This thing can kill, threaten lives. My brother, he was incinerated like he was nothing. His existence gone in the blink of an eye. I fired 3 more shots at the creature. Finally, it combusted into a white flame, the heat from which nearly burned my skin. When the flames died down and the heat had dissipated, the fear was all that remained. The glowing men were one-shot kills, but the wheel creatures, we were going to need to fire several times, which could lessen our time and the amount of bullets. I can't begin to think about going to sleep right now, for the sake of my life. I'm too exhausted to transcribe more of the journal right now. I'll post more entries as soon as I've transcribed them. I won't be poisoned just yet, so I have time. Here are some more entries from the journal. I probably have 2 days to give you the rest. Anyway, the Soviet Union killed God while conducting an experiment with interdimensional portals. And then they went into a covert war with a large group of glowing men. Entry 12. On week 8, day 3, I got word the glowing men had stopped coming out of the gateway. The portal had closed and a letter was left behind. Apparently the letter read, "We don't and can't understand your world. Reading the minds of your people is impossible," which could only mean one of two things. 1. An alternate Yahweh is the almighty God of your world, who isn't letting us into your minds and spirits. Or 2. There is no God ruling your world. Yeshua, the Son of Yahweh, has taken the throne in heaven and now oversees heaven and earth. He has instructed us to turn the other cheek and close the portal to your unpredictable world. I chuckled at the incredulity of what I heard. So it was God and we had really killed him. But this couldn't be it, right? I lost my brother to God's vengeful angels. If I had to fight and be in hell with him, then so be it. Once I reported back to the base, I met my commander for the first time in weeks. "So, the war ended today, huh?" I asked. "That was another intense one." "It ended 2 days ago," said the commander. "Did you get the news?" About the glowing men being God's angels, and the fact that we had killed God. "Yes. Top commanders want to open the portal and sweep heaven for its crimes against our union. If Jesus really keeps his word, we shouldn't have a hard time doing so," I said. I was glad that the war was over. As for the wishes of those at the top, I can't stand the thought of going through the portal. The angels wanted us dead, and their creatures were terrifying on top of being deadly. But I can shake it to defend the Union and avenge my comrades. Entry 13. Over lunch that day, discussion surrounding God and the Bible was mounting. God was dead and his angels avenged him by killing a bunch of us, and we were supposed to take it. What surprises me is that God was real in the first place. I was raised an atheist, although that's probably due to Stalin's crackdown on Christianity. My parents never spoke of any religion or God, so practicing religion always seemed alien to me. I had a babysitter who was obsessed with God, but I never practiced religion with him. I don't think I need to understand what God's army was trying to convey when they killed my brother, but it for sure wasn't all that good. Entry 14. I'm sitting on my bed right now having just read a letter from Khrushchev. This is going to be interesting. Moments ago, letters were handed out to each of us. I could only guess that it had to do with Yahweh. I opened mine up. It was a statement from Khrushchev. I read it all the way to the end without hesitating. This is what it said. In the past 2 months, we suffered great casualties, all at the hands of beings religions worship and call good. Reviewing the Holy Bible, I have found multiple instances of God or Yahweh committing atrocious acts during the time that he was alive. Exodus chapter 21 verses 20 to 21. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or 2, since the slave is their property. Leviticus chapter 25 verses 44 through 46. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you, and the members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property, and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Peter chapter 2 verse 18. Slaves in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. Remember, slave labor was a thing in America, and slave owners used the Bible to confirm their supposed righteousness. Then there was Job. Job worshipped God more than anybody, but had his family and pets killed by God. as a way of proving to Satan that he could kill and abuse the people who followed him, and they would still have faith in him because of his insistence that he was great. God was so full of himself, he betrayed his own people to prove himself and to serve his own ego. Samuel chapter 15 verses 2-3. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them, put death to men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Children and infants were included, not spared despite their innocence. I thought the Bible was fiction written in a time when people killed those who related to criminals by blood, but seeing as we made contact with a world where beings like the ones written about in religious scripture are very real, I can proclaim that we have been attacked by another cult army led by a mad, egotistical tyrant who would go as far as eliminating those who don't follow their beliefs, as well as those who aren't able to make rational or irrational decisions yet. We will reopen the portal and then we will march into heaven and overthrow whoever has succeeded at Yahweh and replace them with a victim of their forced suffering. Your commanders will give you detail on when Operation Fighting Angels will continue. It seems like I'll be heading into a land of horror and uncertainty. I just got consumed by chills recalling the Ophanim. Every time I recall it, I get a sense of impending doom. Hopefully I can take them down before they take my life. Entry 15. I'm about to head out to the portal. A ton of us are going in. This is the weirdest thing that we have ever faced, but all I want to do is to make it out of this alive. Entry 16. Well, I can say that I made it into heaven, but I'm completely lost right now. A pit formed in my stomach as I neared the portal. We went in a single line, probably the longest one that I had ever been in. As I stepped through the light, I nearly froze, but then I saw the other side. A healthy green forest, a beautiful blue sky. I looked to my left and noticed some mountains in the distance. Despite all of that, there was an eerie calmness, like you're being watched by somebody but you can't figure out where they are. As we walked through the forest, there was tension in the air. I held my gun close to my face and continued to follow behind my comrades. Soon enough, I heard an ear-puncturing boom, and then I was blinded by a light and pushed back into the soldier behind me. We both fell onto the muddy ground while the others fired in the direction that the boom had happened. I rolled into a bush and refocused while breathing heavily. Peeking out of the bush, I noticed two glowing men navigating through the trees. I fired at them both as quickly as I could. I hit one of them, but I missed the other. He shot a look of determination in my direction. I fired at him before he could react. I just kept going, looking around, waiting till I was in the clear, and then moving through the trees, heart beating fast as I made my way to a good spot to take cover for when I needed to. I had to have traveled miles through that forest before anything else had happened. I heard some shouting followed by multiple sonic booms, echoing throughout the area. My heart sped up even more. I ducked behind a bush and I remained alert. I moved several times and shot countless glowing men. Every single time I'm about to take a shot, I dread missing the target. I would die for my country, but I wish to continue serving Khrushchev and his anti-Stalinist agenda. Entry 17. After a few minutes of rest, I sensed an overwhelming presence. I peeked out of the bush and beyond the tips of the trees, there was a giant set of rotating wheels adorned with eyes. It had to have been miles wide and miles tall. My heart sank. I watched as a dozen shiny white beings descended into the forest. My view of them was soon obscured by the trees. I had no other choice but to run and make sure that I continued contributing to the mission. I jumped out of the bush and sprinted for my life, navigating the dense forest. As I ran, a series of ear-puncturing booms shook the ground beneath me. About 10 minutes of heavy breathing later, I reached a cliff. Off in the distance was a rail yard on the edge of a small town. It was packed with probably hundreds of people. However, I was too far away to be able to determine if they were my comrades. As I watched on, I heard a thud behind me. I turned around and saw a glowing white being with 4 heads. 3 of them looked just like the heads of animals. One of them looked like a human head. Before I could react, I was knocked unconscious by an invisible force. I awoke in a basement with cracked walls and dented pipes. A man who looked to be in his 50s was sitting in a chair directly across from me. He had shiny hair. My first thought was that I had been kidnapped. However, this man was not glowing. What did he want? He chuckled. "Oh, so you're one of the soldiers from a different dimension," he said. "Yes," I said. "Soviet." "Oh, I know. I heard of the experiment. The portal closing in on God, and just like that, they died." I didn't have much to say. My head was still spinning from everything that had happened, and so I asked him who he was. "I'm the one that you're going to help," he said. "Are you an angel? No. I don't associate myself with people who exclude and kill those who don't follow or torture as so-called truth." "You're willing to fight with us?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "You guys did something that shattered our universe. The uprising is now going to start 3 years earlier than I had originally planned." The man balled up his hands into a fist, and then a patch of blurriness appeared between the man's face and my own. The blurry orb became an image of a white church with a crowd of people huddled around it. I could see movement in the crowd. The devil was showing me a film, or a form of extrasensory vision. He explained it was what was going on all over planet Earth. There were religious people huddled in and around each and every religious building on the planet. Young people, old people, animals too. But not just people, he then showed me a different vision. One similar, one to the last, but taking place at the Notre Dame Cathedral. People were clogging the roads and some were sitting on top of cars. When God died, the world went into a collective shock. Since then, depression statistics have skyrocketed. People have become agitated, blaming one another for God's death. He showed me a vision of dead bodies lying in the streets of New York City. If I went to Earth to spread the truth about God, I would be outcasted. And God tried to frame me as the evil one, and he did so successfully, just by making me a main antagonist. And then over thousands of years using popular culture to frame me as a giant red bull with horns who had a lot of spiritual power and did all the bad things that God did. Wars, natural disasters, cannibalism. God enabled all that, not me. I've been hoping to one day put an end to God's ruthless vengeance. I couldn't be anything more than amazed, especially with the part about him being framed as the evil one. I couldn't believe it, but I was speaking with the actual devil. "They followed him so blindly," the devil said. "Like they don't know he's in support of torture. They spin it as his great plan, but that's just rationalizing the torture that they're being put through. They were told, hey, follow this man for he's the righteous one. They all just went with it and he won. Anybody who disobeyed him was executed, even despite being commanded not to kill. Some of them argue that it's righteous, but if killing is bad, then it's bad. I've killed, but only because God forced me to for the sake of his own ego. God killed 2 million. I killed 5, not 5 million, just 5. One with the power of God could bring those 5 lives back, but Yahweh didn't want to. I still couldn't believe it. The devil was on my side. I kept listening as he told me the New Testament was God gaslighting his followers. Just because somebody apologizes for something they did doesn't mean that they didn't do it. If you instilled trauma, don't expect somebody to come back to you. But then you have those religious extremists who harm people in the name of God. They're brainwashed children, At least those who aren't abusive see God in their own liberating way. This was beginning to hit close to home. I tried to sway the conversation to the uprising that he mentioned. Well, if God is dead, who are we going to bring down other than the angels? The devil shot me an understanding look, a distinct one that I had never been given before. Who do you like, women or men? We've constructed many different types of weapons for this very patriotic war. It's alright, you do what you're actually comfortable with doing. You're accepted here. The devil went on to explain the uprising. Now that God was dead, all we had to do was finish off his army. Easier said than done. There were not enough soldiers in the devil's army to give, in his words, the captives of hell the upper hand. That was until the army that angered God's angels. Half of them swarmed my reality, and apparently we had massacred them all. They were unfamiliar with the laws of my reality, but they were too vengeful to stay away. Now the remaining half sit in heaven, having massacred nearly all of my comrades. My heart dropped at the news. The devil, however, told me that I didn't need to feel an inch of concern, as some time ago, he had convinced a third of God's army that the deity they worshipped so much was actually the devil lying to and gaslighting everyone. The angels believed that to be true, and so they mutinied. They all got sent to hell for uprising. Apparently, my army killed as many angels as those who mutinied, leaving only 1/3 left. How many angels did my comrades and I kill? I asked. Over 1 million, said the devil. What about guardian angels? There has to be billions of them, especially after the baby boom. How is 1 million only 1/3? Guardian angels don't fight God's war. They surveil children, the devil said. What's Jesus Christ doing in all this? I asked. Jesus Christ was the human manifestation of God, not a separate entity. Now it's time to get to the planning stage of the uprising. The devil laid out his plan. Essentially, we were going into heaven in groups and then using guerrilla warfare to destabilize whatever order they currently had. After that, a vote would be held for a new leader, a new god, a god who would establish a new order and clean up the mess that Yahweh made. But there was a catch, one that wasn't surprising. There's a 50% chance you perish in the uprising no matter how well you take cover. My heart still sunk, however, but these beasts had to be stopped. I was in a position where I could help sway the order of heaven, which this concept was still very incredulous to me. Either way, it was what I had to do. My intuition was screaming at me to go and fight. I was going to end this. After the plans were discussed, the devil told me that he wanted to show me a little something. He brought me upstairs to his living room, and there he told me to look out the window, and when I did, a pit formed in my stomach. People were hanging from the tree branches of every tree. The grass was yellow. Parked cars were vandalized, and bones were lying on the rooftops of homes. I shuddered and I looked back at the devil. Who did those bodies belong to? Innocent doctors, psychologists, teachers. They were men who liked men, women who liked women, people with blemishes, women who wanted to be without a husband and choose what to do with their own lives and their own bodies. Oh, and some of those bodies you see are still alive. You couldn't tell which ones though. They're in shock due to multiple factors. I'm sleeping in the basement tonight. I recommend you follow through on that promise. Who in their right mind would murder innocents? The devil sighed. At least the Soviets are a necessary shield, he whispered to himself. Why wouldn't we be? Oh no, I meant that differently, no. Anyway, before we do anything else, I'm going to show you a wider picture of the world out there. The devil brought me out to his car, a yellow four-door with dents and scratches all over. I was taken on a drive. Moving down the road, I gagged as bodies hung from the trees. Some swayed, the road was cracked and had a few holes filled with red liquid. Moving along a main road, I noticed a very similar scene, but there weren't as many cars around as I thought there would be on a road like that. A few minutes later, still moving down the road, The devil pointed out a gang stabbing taking place in a parking lot. People were walking by looking dead in the face, not reacting to the dispute. The devil then hit the brakes. A dozen, I'm not sure what to call them, small spiky animals would spit mini fireballs every 3 seconds. They were walking across the street. One of them was carrying what looked to be a charred human hand, but I'm not so sure. These things were clearly dangerous, and my heart rate increased as I waited for them to pass. Eventually they did, and moments later a truck with an eerie logo passed us from the opposite direction. Forbidden meat, it's not immoral. What was that supposed to mean? If somebody comes to the door and asks you to meet them at a special restaurant at 5 p.m., and they don't have anything official on them, close the door, the devil said. That was the only thing he had said to me the whole drive. The rest was just pointing. Aside from the first few things I mentioned, I witnessed a young man being shot in the neck, saw boarded up windows on several shopping centers, saw 5 crumbled homes, 10 groups of homeless individuals, and a lamb with 5 eyes that stood in one spot, staring at me with a look of sinister determination. It was a crazy scene out there, but I guess that's what I had to know. The cage that God put innocent people in was the same place that he put killer creatures, murderers, and other monsters. Entry 18. I'm sitting on a bed in the basement, while 2 mattresses stacked on top of each other would be a better description. I hear animalistic screams echoing from all directions outside. There's now a deep pit of dread in my stomach. I don't know what might happen to me while I'm asleep. Hopefully, I'll wake up without a mark. Also, the windows down here don't have any curtains, so I'm going to turn out the lights so that none of whatever the heck's out there will see me. I managed to save myself one more day. Here are the rest of the entries. Entry 19. My heart's pounding and I don't know where I am, and I can't say for sure whether I'm safe. After I set out with my group, we bypassed the guards by tunneling under heaven until reaching the sewers. I guess the devil thought the sewers would be mostly unguarded, but once we set foot in them, shouting started coming from both directions. Glowing men. My heart dropped. There was nowhere to duck, and I shot at the men, relieved to see them combust. As we trekked through the dimly lit sewers, I took note of how horrible it smelled. It didn't matter so much every time we neared a corner. My adrenaline level skyrocketed. Would there be glowing men waiting for me, and would I live? I resorted to just shooting blindly around the corner. It worked 5 times. Eventually, we reached a drain one of my group members claimed was the first one from the city. She told me to follow behind. Since they could hover, they would just fly up out of the sewer. Since I couldn't hover, I would climb, but I would be guarded in a circular formation. From there, I would shoot any angel coming overhead. Easier said than done. I need to stop expecting ease of force from my end. Once I climbed up to the street, the sonic booms began. A dozen angels flew above the street. I opened fire for my life, taking out each angel as they flew close enough for me to hit. I barely paid attention to what was happening on the ground around me. All I heard were booms, shattering glass, car alarms, and shouting from all directions. At one point, I needed to take cover. I looked around and saw all the chaos. I ran through a shattered shop window and hid behind a table. An angel landed on the ground. I shot at it and it combusted. As I anticipated, the second another angel revealed itself, a deep male voice hit my right ear. "Hey, you from the kingdom of the devil, or are you of God?" I looked to my right and saw an elderly man pointing a double-barrel shotgun at my head. Some shouting echoed in from outside. I looked and saw 2 angels sprinting towards the shop. "Are you of God?" answered the question. I jumped out from behind the table. The 2 angels' eyes widened. They aimed their guns right at me. I grabbed the shotgun wielder by the hips and pulled him in front of me. He combusted into white flames while I jumped behind his desk for cover. I jumped up and fired at both of the angels. Both of them combusted as well. The war went on for weeks. Those weeks weren't so different from weeks that I spent fighting wars in the past. In the middle of week 4, I woke up as the sun began shining and noticed how silent the city was. Perhaps all the civilians had evacuated. During my journey through the war-torn city, I came across a restaurant with shattered windows. I took a look inside. The tables were all lying on their sides. Food was strewn all over the floor. As I looked around, a wet screeching noise echoed from the sky. I looked up. A giant ophanim was about to fly overhead. My heart sank. I jumped through a shattered window to hide in the restaurant. I knew it took several bullets to take out a small ophanim, but I couldn't imagine what it would take to bring down a giant one. The dreadful sound of the ophanim peaked, but once it began to pass, I took note of a television on the far end of the room. I walked up to it and switched it on, hoping to get some news updates. I flipped through the channels until I found a broadcast showing a giant ophanim hovering above a city that I couldn't recognize. Many of the skyscrapers in the city were on fire, and then explosions rocked about 10 or 15 of the skyscrapers, taking each of them down. Meanwhile, fires were spreading like crazy across the surrounding forest. And with that, heaven's final option is hammering the city at the center of hell. The destruction of evil in the name of God has begun. I watched in horror. Heaven's final option, innocents are dying, people are being tortured. As I fumed, I heard the sound of somebody stepping on a piece of glass outside. I didn't have time to turn my head before I blacked out. I woke up in someplace dark. Feeling around, I felt a cold, hard-tiled floor. What room was I in? Who captured me? I felt around some more and found a lamp. I switched it on, revealing the room that I was in. Torn up papers, photos, and posters were strewn all over the ground. Entry 20. After writing up the last entry, I looked through the torn up papers. Some of them depicted God, Jesus, and different angels. Others were pages from the Bible. I held one of the torn pages and read half of what was on it. I crumpled it up and threw it at the wall. The door creaked open. I jumped, hoping that it wasn't one of those glowing men. I grabbed my gun and aimed it at the door. I was relieved to see that it was a non-glower. She had black hair and looked to be in her mid to late 20s. Her eyes widened. "Oh no, it's okay," she said. "I'm on your side. Your fellow soldiers are going to be back soon." I was relieved, but I didn't know who she was. Was she associated with the devil? Or was she someone else entirely? I asked her. "Eve," she said, "your fellow soldiers need you." "I know they do," I said. "We have creatures to eliminate." "You've already pretty much won the war. Don't let your guard down, though. Because the angels are avenging God and destroying hell as we speak. Your soldiers need you to help them bring in a bomb that you and them call the Parakuzma, according to them. The Parakuzma was an atomic bomb that we were developing as part of the construction of anti-anomalous weaponry following the accidental death of God. I told her this, but I also informed her of the fact that we hadn't tested it due to our efforts to conceal our war on Yahweh's spirits. We would only test it in the most dire of times when a war with the West wouldn't sound so threatening. She told me that I was ordered by the words of my commander to help bring the bomb into heaven. I told her that I needed to be shown something official just in case, even though she already knew of the weapons development project. She brought me out into a large room with shiny marble walls, a high ceiling with 3 skylights, and a marble-tiled floor. Several of my comrades were conversing with each other in the corner, some recognizable from previous missions and others not. One of the ones that I recognized, Dimitri, told me the order was legitimate, and then he told me that we needed to get back to the portal. A pit formed in my stomach. "Is it still open?" I asked. "How far away is it from here? Where are we?" "Yes, it's still open," Vladimir said. "The devil has our backs though, don't worry. Now get prepared." My comrades left the room, leaving me alone with Eve. Eve walked over to a gold-plated chest that sat a little over to my left. She opened it up, reached into it, and pulled out a stone with words engraved into it. She placed the stone on the floor in front of her. "What does it say?" I asked. "They're the 10 Commandments," she said. "Well, 5 of the 10. The other stone is still in the chest. I'll be taking care of that one right after I take care of this one." She brushed her hair back with her hands. I wasn't sure what she meant when she said that she'd be taking care of them. That was until she pulled a jagged rock out of her pocket, bent down towards the stone, and began to scrape the first commandment where it was engraved in the stone, leaving white scratches. "I don't know if you've read my story, but I was the one who was manipulated into eating an apple," she said. "Adam was responsible for me, you, and blamed me for him failing to be responsible. Adam was punished and so was the serpent, but so was I." She began to scratch out the second commandment. "All that apple contained was knowledge on how to separate good from evil. That's what God wanted to keep hidden, and he expected us to know any better. The devil wants to set up a new kingdom led by a new leader, and there's been some talk of me most likely being the next leader. If so, I'm going to undo all the terrible things that Yahweh did." She moved on to the third commandment, scraping it like no tomorrow. And Job refused the position. He said that he just wants his livelihood back. Adam finally realized what he was doing when he blamed me for him not taking responsibility. And the devil told me that he doesn't plan on being the next leader. So that leaves me. "Well, isn't the devil very powerful too?" I asked. "Not as powerful as you may think," she said as she began to scrape the 5th commandment. "He's not the exact opposite of God. He just worked for God. At some point he realized how crappy God was and rebelled against him and his order. He's more of a political influence, but anybody can be God with a specific piece of knowledge." My comrades entered the room. I walked up to them, determined to get the rest of the fight over with. One that I was more familiar with, Dmitri, looked into my eyes. "You ready, Artem?" he asked. "Yeah, this place is chaotic. Almost everything here has thrown me off guard, but if I keep up my willingness to fight and defend, I should be able to defend myself against those atrocious creatures." My comrades all nodded their heads in agreement. Despite the agreement, there was something else on my mind. My location. Where was I? I asked my comrades as I heard the second stone be placed on the floor. "Well, you're standing in God's mansion," Vladimir said. "We wiped out most of the guards and low-level employees. We hoped that Noah would be here as well, but we didn't find him. Still, they had some pretty powerful guards. It took minutes to kill some of them, but we pulled it off. We can now sincerely say the throne of God is occupied." "Where's the devil?" I asked. "He's hiding out on Earth," Vladimir said. "He believes that we can pull this off, but we also need to get the 4 giant Ophanim creatures to hover in one spot. Wiping out their guards and low-level employees should do it," I said. "It will not," Vladimir said. "They can be replaced. There needs to be a big enough distraction to get all 4 of them in the same area. The devil has a plan he hopes will work. He didn't tell us what it was, so it must be a job for a smaller set of higher-up individuals." "He hopes?" I asked. "There's a 60% chance it will," he says, Vladimir said. "We're dealing with powerful beings." "How powerful is the Parakuzma?" I asked. "Is it anything like AN 602? "It's twice as powerful, comrade," Vladimir said. "Are the devil and Eve going to be hiding in a shelter?" I asked. "The devil told me that he, Adam, and Eve will be hiding out on Earth, watching heaven's central city get vaporized," Vladimir said. "Well, all right then, let's continue." "We must wait for the devil's comrades to arrive," Vladimir said. Remember, I know, I interrupted. We're bags of flesh going up against anomalous beings. But now that we have more time to discuss things, what do you think the effects of this will be? We've discovered interdimensional travel. It happened to be this dimension of all the possible ones. And if the West finds out what we've been doing, they would hold it against us. We'll see where we can go from here, Vladimir said. I nodded my head in agreement. This did feel like the beginning of something, and I was going to experience it. I turned towards Eve, who was reaching into the golden box. Both stones were sitting on the floor, all scraped up. Nobody needed those commandments if they were also commanded to do things that contradict them. Eve? I asked. Yeah, she said, pulling an object out of the box. Thank you. This will all be over soon. Eve was holding in her right hand a golden goblet cup adorned with red diamonds close to the rim. You're welcome, she said. Eve tilted the cup. A red liquid spilled out onto the floor. Once all the liquid had been poured out, Eve set the cup on the ground and stomped on it, making a sizable dent. She stomped on the cup again and again and again until it was pretty much flat. And then she looked at us. You guys need to leave. This room is off limits now. All right, let's go, Dimitri said. We stepped out of the room, leaving Eve to her business. In the lobby, we met up with the Devil's comrades who asked us if we had everything that we needed. We each told them yes, and with that, we were on our way to finish this. We marched down the deserted main road, past all the abandoned shops with blown-out windows. We were expecting just a few angels, but then that noise came back, that wet growl. I looked up and saw a giant ophanim slowly appearing in the sky. The clouds separated for it, and I felt terrified at it. My heart sunk so deep that I froze for a second. Get to the sewer, I yelled. It was our only way out of this one, and I couldn't stress it enough either. It had to have seen us out in the open. One of Satan's men ran to the nearest sewer drain and pulled it right off. My comrades and I were the first to go. I sped down there and then I began jogging south. I looked behind me, seeing my comrades all having made it down, and the Devil's comrades floating in. However, only half of them were in the sewer when a blinding white light beamed through the manhole. One of the remaining comrades shouted, telling us to run. I expected it to take at least an hour for us to get to the portal, but 2 hours had gone by and we still weren't there. The smell was unbearable, and I had no idea if a horde of glowing men were about to swarm us, and we only had half the Devil's men we were supposed to have. My fear turned into reality when I started hearing familiar shouting echoes from both directions. Oh, great. It had happened so quickly. My memory is hazy, but what I can say is, when we heard the voices, the Devil's comrades shielded us. Once they rounded a corner out in front of us, it was just deafeningly loud booms for 5 seconds. We waited silently, then before we could count to 10, a couple more rounded the corner. They were shot and killed. One of the Devil's men, David, signaled for us to remain quiet some more as he walked towards the edge of the intersected sewers. Before he reached it, a black rectangle with moving eyes peered around the corner and shot David with a beam of light. Dread overtook me. There was an ophanim down here. Why was I so afraid of them? Other than because they were killer creatures. Their appearance was just terrifying and creepy. All those eyes. I aimed my gun at it, waiting for it to peer around the corner again. Another of the Devil's men started towards the spot that the ophanim was. When he neared the spot, he tossed a grenade. It exploded and the ophanim hovered out from behind the corner while making the worst screech that I had ever heard. A third of it had been blown off. It was leaking heavily and I was barely able to stay up. It landed on the ground, continuing to screech. I opened fire at it. 1 shot and it was gone. Eventually David told us to stop moving. He pointed to a drain up ahead and told us that it was the nearest drain to the portal. This was all almost over. Good. But then David told us that we were miles away from the portal, so we needed to be quick. As he told us the giant Ophanim were probably hovering around the central city, he got a call on his radio. "This may be shocking, but the devil's plan has failed. We need to get through the portal before any angel finds out what our intentions are." That couldn't be too hard, right? We climbed out of the sewer. The sweet smell of fresh air was delightful, a great break from the stench. All we needed to do was hurry through the forest. We ran for what felt like an hour. We avoided buildings, farmhouses, everything. It was going to take a while to reach the portal, so we discussed hideouts for when we needed to sleep. At some point, we came across a bunker, and David told us to get inside. Before I could step in, somebody was shouting in our direction. "What are you people doing with my shelter?" I looked to my left and saw a farmer. "Training," I lied. He picked up a shotgun and aimed it at me. "You guys look like those invaders. Get out of here or I'm calling the police," he shouted. In defense, I shot him and he combusted. I stepped into the bunker where I met up with my comrades. After we woke up, David told us that we could pile into the pickup truck in the driveway and proceed with the rest of the trip. He insisted on protecting us on our way there. There were 6 Soviets, including me, so 2 could sit in the front, and 4 could sit in the bed of the truck. It seemed simple enough. After breakfast, we made our way to the truck. My comrades and I hopped into the truck while the Devil's men took their positions around the truck. And then we began our journey down the roads of the farmland. Adrenaline rushed through me as I thought about the possibility of being found and vaporized by a giant Ophanim. About 10 minutes away from the portal, the truck broke down. We pulled up to the side of the road and made the rest of our way on foot across the calm forest. Some moments into the walk, I saw a white light shining in the distance. That was it. Shortly after I spotted the portal, I heard it again, that echoing growl. I looked up for a quick second and saw a giant Ophanim. I picked up my pace until I was running as fast as my legs could take. Once out of the forest, my adrenaline spiked. If the Ophanim couldn't see me in the forest, it could see me out in the open field of grass. It took me a few seconds to realize that the Ophanim hadn't harmed me, although it seemed like it would have already. I could still hear it growling up there, and worse, I felt it staring. They burned my psyche and they were chilling as hell. I reached the portal and without looking back, I sprinted through it. I didn't at all mind the transition from the warm climate to the snow and freezing air. The second before I ran through the portal, I felt 4 sets of eyes staring at me from behind, followed by 4 thuds behind me as well. The air got warmer too. I didn't have much time to think about it, as I needed to get to the arsenal in which the Parakuzma missile was housed. I was then ordered to guard the portal, so I went over and stood by it. While on guard, a gruesome and terrifying statement was made to my comrades and I. It didn't change what I thought about heaven or God, I mean not at all. In fact, it made it all a whole lot worse. It happened so suddenly, and I happened to be glancing at the portal when a human skeleton covered in ash was wheeled out by a flaming man. It's hard to describe where his flames began and his body ended. The air heated up like an oven in his presence though. He gave me a smirk and then he said, "Let this be an example of what will happen if any of you step into heaven again. The flame consumes the wicked." He turned around and stepped through the portal and back into heaven. The air began to freeze, but my disgust wasn't going anywhere. Once my comrades arrived with the missile, it was pointed out the portal was in the wrong position to fire a nuclear missile aiming for the center of heaven. So we put the machines powering the portal up on a platform, and then connected the platform to a helicopter. Once the helicopter lifted the portal high enough, we carefully aimed the missile at the needed angle. Within minutes, we got 3 of our commanders to vote on the decision to covertly launch the missile. All 3 of them voted to proceed with the launch. It was time. Not a minute after the vote, the missile was launched. It flew through the air without an issue, gliding perfectly. It flew through the portal and then the portal closed. The platform was slowly lowered back to the ground and then disconnected from the helicopter. It was determined the city would be far enough away to make a quick observation from the heaven side of the portal. However, remembering what the flaming person had presented, my heart dropped. I didn't want my comrades to be incinerated. I showed them the skeleton and I told them what happened. "What was his name?" asked my commander. I wasn't told, but the fact that we can't recognize them says enough. How will we know if we've succeeded? I had enough of this. If this was where traveling through portals was going to take us, I might as well go back to my regular life, the one already full of near-death experiences. "I'll go take a look," I said. "If I don't come back, then we probably failed." I stepped up to the portal, expecting to be met with excruciating pain. I stopped. Wanting to let my comrades know that we won, I stepped through the portal. The first thing that I saw was a huge mushroom cloud. The wind was still blowing from the explosion, but it had clearly died down by the time that I had arrived. 2 giant ophanims were lying still on the ground, burning up in flames. Their eyes were lifeless and gray. A third one floated erratically through the air, left to right. It too was up in flames, but not as much as the other 2 were. The flames were definitely spreading though. I smiled for the first time in months. The wild beasts were dying. As I looked up in relief, a flame caught my attention. 4 separate fires were spreading across the grass. Adrenaline rushed through me. The giant ophanim let out an echoing shriek, chilling enough to catch my full attention. I looked up and saw the colossal creature hurling towards me. My heart sped up. I leapt backwards through the portal, tripping and falling backwards into the snow. My comrades cheered. Despite the fact that I was still alive, I was in panic. I got up to my feet and shouted at my commander, telling him to shut the portal. I explained what I had seen, and then everybody gritted their teeth. The portal was then shut before any fires or ophanim debris could get through. Entry 21. I can finally start a new entry. I took a break from writing for a couple of days after the end of the war. The central government is going to cover up the loss of 1.5 million soldiers for the sake of not heightening tensions with the West. It's not something that we usually do, but the situation we went through was nothing usual. It was an incident that we don't want to talk about. The mechanics are far too confusing. Entry 22. I never thought that I would pick up this journal again. Today is November 16th, 1964. Minutes ago, I found a film in my basement that I didn't see yesterday, all set up and everything. The film was in color and began in a field of grass. In the distance was a forest. Further off in the distance was the skyline of Metropolis that lined up the horizon. And then there was a flash of light. The light dissipated and in the distance was a growing mushroom cloud. The film ended with a total runtime of 15 seconds. It was amazing to see the actual explosion. That was a major historical moment for them. The film came with a letter, and this is what it read. Artem, thank you for assisting my people in the uprising. The new god in power has sealed off my reality from those entering with malicious intent. So I can let you know what I wanted you to know, but waited for the right time to tell you. I knew the right time would be any time after I received your help, as you would have likely taken criticism terribly. What I want you to know is, you and your fellow Soviets need to know torture is never okay. I'm not sure if you're guilty of it yourself, but if you are, please change your view on it. The Soviet Union is guilty of many of the things it criticizes. Sincerely, the one they call the devil. All I'll say is, I'm glad that I started out as a draftee rather than a blunt psychopath. I wonder how things are going in heaven, hell, and earth. Hopefully everybody's in a better place than they were before. As of the 23rd of October 2023, I'm stationed way out in the northeast Siberian Tundra. We've got these little caravan type things to live in for a couple weeks that we're staying. Why am I out here? Work. There's no other reason to be out this far, not for any man. Thus it came as a shock finding a dead body all the way out in the literal middle of nowhere, hundreds of miles from civilization. I see no feasible explanation as to how this man got out here. I'm part of a team assigned to a geological survey. Simply put, I'm here to analyze soil. Yeah, it's exhilarating. Anyway, that's beside the point. I'm not here to detail my scintillating career. I found the body on the second day on a slope out westwards. The cold had set him into a statue inevitably, but it looked like he had died crawling on all fours. Something seemed off about the way that he was posed, which I quickly realized was due to him resting on 2 legs and 1 arm. The corpse still had all its limbs. It's just that the left arm was pulled up into the chest, and the hand attached was clasped tightly around a book. A journal, to be exact. Naturally, I read a fair few pages before having the idea to write this. Writing's not something that I frequent, and it doesn't come easy to me, so you'll forgive me if my tone leans towards being clinical. I'm a dirt analyst, give me a break. Anyway, I thought the journal might shed some light on how this guy wound up all the way out here in this barren place. That said, its contents are strange to say the least, and I'm not closer to an answer as I was when I first discovered the body. I don't know what to make of the journal's contents, but I'm hoping this is just a sick joke, or some monumental misunderstanding. The way that it's written seems literary in nature, although as I found out later on there may be a good reason for that. I'm going to transcribe the first few pages below. I'll start with the only page with a bookmark. That is, if you could call an old shred of fabric a bookmark. Anyway, here it is. Do you think we're dead? I gave Eleanor a perplexed look. I can see your breath and we're talking right now, so... No, she muttered, shivering in the keening wind. Not here, no sense in asking that here. I mean out there. I stared out past the dark sea, reaching to the horizon and likely further still than I could ever conceive of. They say that hell is hot. As I sit on the ramshackle heights that we fight every day to maintain, the cold clawing at my skin, I truly wish it was. My mother used to say, as long as you tried. Those 5 words hammered strength into my psyche. They once gave meaning in battling hardships and misery. Now, well, that's a dangerous epithet. You're free to try if so inclined. Just know that none of us will even try to save you when your belly is sliced open and your guts slurped by the creatures that dog this place. We've had our fill of brazen souls out here. They serve to be torn apart in our place. I suppose that it's something to be grateful for. The braver you are, the quicker that you'll learn. Bravery is as insubstantial as death in this place. I should backtrack. I'm an extremophile, always have been. After the first time that adrenaline rush flooded my veins, I was hooked. Water sports, base jumping, spelunking, anything you can name, it's likely under my belt. The one activity that I found myself coming back to was mountaineering. Ever since my dad took me up Mount Snowdon, there's been an inscrutable urge to summit something higher, something steeper and harsher. This leads me to my most recent trip, summiting Monte Rosa's tallest peak, the Duffer Spitz. My climbing partner and good friend Rob climbed it in 2018. He shared plans of a second summit, so I took him up on the offer. I say climbing partner, but with my skill level I really mean guide. Rob's expertise blows mine out of the water. Nothing much of interest happened on the drive, long, boring, and standard overall. When we arrived, the parking lot serving as our starting point was empty and quiet, dead still. There was an air of unease lingering around us, around me at least. If Rob felt it, he didn't show it, but it was there and I should have taken it as a warning. That's retrospection for you. Looking up at Monte Rosa made everything seem so insignificant. Its monster of a rock face stood mighty and gazed out across the landscape. Ants beholden to a molehill in its dominance. God help any who climb it. Instead, we planned around the Marinelli Couloir, a steep and snow-laden gully. We'd triple-checked our mandatory gear, ice picks, crampons, ropes, etc., all present. Clear and cold mornings were forecast for the ensuing week. Perfect climbing conditions. Rob's meticulous planning was impressive to say the least. I would be lying if I said I wasn't a little envious. The mountain hut alone was a 4-hour climb, though the terrain was forgiving. Hard-packed snow crackled below my crampons, a reassuring sound. Inside was cozy. The walls were insulated well and the wood stove was stocked with more than enough firewood. Yet even as the fire roared, a chill crawled on my back. Just like the parking lot, we were alone, and a nagging intuition in the back of my mind said that may not be coincidental. "Sure you're ready for tomorrow, mate," Rob said, glancing over at me from the counter. Why, I mean, yep, I'm in good hands coming with you. Look, once we're up into the couloir, we aren't turning back, so there's no shame in having second thoughts. No, it's not that, I could come back another time, but who knows how long that I would have to wait. Life's hectic, you know. Might be years past till I can try again. Just making sure, nerves are a dangerous beast up there. As long as you listen to me, you'll be fine, but remember, don't panic. If you're feeling anxious, remind yourself that getting upset won't help your situation. Heat from the waning coals coddled my body. Only embers flickered by the time that I began to nod off into a deep and dreamless sleep. We set off at 8 a.m. after having oatmeal and berries. The first few hours ended up being a tough yomp along the snowfield skirting around towards the couloir. Azure sky gazed down through wispy high cirrus. We were about a mile from the gully when light snowfall started up. It wasn't hugely surprising being on a mountain and all, but the sky remained clear. If anything, it had grown clearer over the past hour, and still the snow fell regardless. It was such a bizarre sight that I worried I might be getting altitude sickness. As icy pinpricks pelted my skin, the reality of the situation dawned on me. Visibility was dropping by the minute, and within 10, I could scarcely see Rob 20 feet ahead. And then he was gone. I don't mean his silhouette bled away into the whiteout. I mean even his footprints were entirely covered over. I called out to him in a panic, cupping my hands together in a futile attempt to pierce the howling gale. Hoping to catch sight of Rob, I plodded forward another 100 or so yards. Nothing. My next actions I still ruminate over today, forcing me to curse my own cowardice. Even if I was the one who had disappeared, I didn't know that at the time. Without Rob to guide me, I thought that I was surely going to die. And so I turned back. Following the compass, I made a steady descent, hoping to get back to the hut faster than we had come up. The fresh dusting of snow made frantic steps a danger, and I slipped several times. After an hour, my view was unchanged, pure whiteness. In my retreat, I had somehow failed to notice a crucial detail. I wasn't going downhill. It seemed like I was in a flat snowfield, but when I turned a full 360 to get my bearings, I found that I was actually facing a gentle incline. A fresh wave of terror crashed down in my mind. I glanced down at the compass and to my horror, saw its needle replaced by a listless spinning blur. I tried my best. Mom would have been proud, but the cold wore me down, the snow merciless as it pelted me. My footsteps grew closer and closer together until there were no footsteps at all. I crouched on one knee, I wasn't shivering anymore. Well, I did feel pretty warm. Hot, actually. I went to unzip my coat when a stark patch of lime caught my attention. An abandoned tent, long left to endure the elements. It looked old. My dulling mind didn't catch the oddity that it wasn't already buried by snow. Our tent was in Rob's pack, and with him out of the picture, this was my only chance at survival. There were a few small tears in the canvas, but the tent sufficed in its primary purpose. Still, I had no means of warming myself up. Bundled tight in my sleeping bag, I felt the weight of exhaustion settle, and no sooner did my eyelids droop and my eyes roll back. The fact that I awoke at all filled me with a sense of relief. Brain still groggy, I sat up and observed the tent's interior. It had fared well in the figurative flashbang of a snowstorm. Something was different. The small tears only looked out onto white, but all was quiet. Never has there been a silent blizzard. Only when a cold shock hit my foot did I notice the mounds of melting slush on the floor directly beneath each rip in the tent. I was snowed in. Adrenaline flooded my veins and sent my thoughts into hyperspeed. How long had I been buried? How much oxygen was left in the tent? How deep was I? Don't panic, freaking out won't help you. I took a deep, controlled breath and crawled over to the zipper, hesitating before tugging it open in one swift motion. White fluff poured into the tent and, in a transitory state between dread and understanding, I scrabbled backwards in fear of an icy casket. My mind cleared. Logically, if the snow was that powdery, I couldn't be down very deep. But still, the tent sagged, its backbone long since snapped. I dragged myself out and pushed my way through the dampening snow, lugging the pack with all my equipment behind me. With the gap collapsing in on itself behind me, I planted my boots in the snow and stood. I wasn't on Monte Rosa. I wasn't in the Alps. I wasn't even on a mountain at all. That's as much as I feel like transcribing tonight. My schedule's now what you would call leisurely, and I need to rest up for all the hiking that I have lined up. I'll post the next section tomorrow evening, when I have some time alone with my laptop. Until then, stay safe, and well away from the cold. Hello again. I've decided to continue these logs. My team's excursion will last another 8 odd days, so I'm under no obligation toward regular updates. I'll record these in what time I can get and post them once I'm back and connected to the internet. I won't drag. Here's the follow one from last time. Standing near the bottom of a sort of half-cone slope, the horizon-wide expanse of dark water was the first hint that I was somewhere else entirely. I could tell the ocean was a ways down, but only after shuffling down to the edge did I catch a glimpse of the precipice. A rugged ice face plummeting some 400 feet. Vertigo struck instantly, knocking me onto my butt, hands splayed like a starfish. Something sticking up near the edge caught my eye. It resembled the curved rails of a pool ladder. If said ladder was poorly made and rickety, with coarse gray rope tied to each side, graying fibers sequestered by an equally ashen backdrop. A tiny ray of hope beamed somewhere deep inside of me. Maybe somebody was here. I crawled through the powder and gripped the steel bars. My gloves did nothing against the exorable chill of wind-beaten metal. Still, desperate curiosity willed my head and shoulders to lean over the precipice. Fixed into the mottled ice, a vertical tower of crude materials swayed in the ever-present winds. It reminded me of a shanty town with its hastily fastened planks and battered metal sheeting. For the life of me, I couldn't fathom what reason any sane person would have to build such a thing. But then again, I had yet to find anything in this place that I could fathom. "Hello," I called out. The first words out of my mouth since waking up were hoarse and weak, tumbling pathetically down the mismatched scaffolding. There was an immediate response from somewhere below, I couldn't see anyone, but there were multiple voices bleeding together into a garbled slur. Relief warped into regret as I remained hunched, frozen, as if I were some frost-caked gargoyle on a forgotten castle. Though my voice barely cut through the winds, I regretted opening my mouth. I didn't quite know why. The frantic shuddering of the platforms as somebody clambered up to meet me instilled a deep and imminent foreboding. I somehow hadn't realized before, but the ropes tied around the bars that I grabbed onto were actually those of a rope ladder. They whipped into the cliffside, heralding the arrival of the figure who had just pushed their way out from under a rotten blue tarp. A disheveled and wild-eyed man pulled his way up the wooden rungs, patchy bundle of matted hair swinging across his face. When he saw me, he paused, wired eyes suddenly morphing into something rabid, before continuing up the ladder with fervor. As if he had dislocated his jaw, dropped wide open and flopped around on its hinges. I didn't know what the expression meant, but suffice to say I was horrified. Those eyes, they betrayed hunger. I flopped onto my back and fumbled with the zipper on my bag, tearing out an ice pack and steeling myself. 2 sets of blackening fingers curled over the rim before me, followed by this bestial vestige of a human climbing up onto the snow in all his wiry might. "Hey, what are you doing there, lad?" I chuckled with transparent unease. He almost looked surprised after I spoke, as if language was a foreign concept to him. He sucked air in through his teeth with a hiss. "Cold, cold, so hungry. You warm, fresh," he spat in a gravelly voice. I backed up, raising the ice pick clutched tight in both hands. The man went a few uncoordinated steps before lunging out of nowhere and diving on top of me. I yelped in fear, falling backwards and raising the pick in defense. The spittle sprayed from yellow teeth, gnashing inches from my face. Acting swiftly, I rammed the blunt handle of the pick into his throat, causing him to recoil. Only seconds later, he persisted with all his rage, seeming to shrug off the blow as though it were an insect bite. In the scuffle, he managed to grab my right arm, and he sunk his teeth into my wrist. I screamed and let go of the pick with my right. Instinctively, I swung it in my left, the sharp end sailing true and embedding directly into the side of his neck. Vicious blood exploded over my face as I wrenched the pick back towards me, tearing the front of his throat open in a ragged gash. The man shot up straight in response, stumbling uncontrollably back to the edge and dropping limply into the open air. And despite my close call, something else disturbed me. The blood that had poured out onto me was cold. I don't mean lukewarm, cold if not freezing. No steam rose into the air as one might expect. It just curdled and froze on my clothing. With no other choice, I crept back to the rope ladder and looked down. A ratty woman had just climbed up into view and paused after seeing the man's body supine on the platform. "Oh, come on, again, Kurt." What she said took me aback, but the bubbling laugh from Kurt was the kicker. Though practically non-existent, he was alive and laughing. "Hey, sorry about him. You can come down, it's safe." I almost joined Kurt in his hysteria. It was such an absurd proposition. Safe? You're dangling off the edge of a sheer cliff. Now let me rephrase. Safer. Trust me, you don't want to spend another minute up there. What? Nah, you're a lunatic. Do as you like, but I won't be on that platform when it collapses. I'm out of here. Are you really? Take a look around. Where in the name of God do you think you are right now? No idea, but even if my chances are 1 in a million at getting home, I would rather die out there than stay here. Oh, me too, traveler. Me too. With that, the conversation was over and the woman tended to Kurt. I refused to witness any more of this madness and I stormed off back up the slope that I had come down from. After a few steady paces, I stopped dead in my tracks. Something was off. Imperceptible movement in the snowfield, distant thuds growing nearer. I squinted to make anything out, but I didn't need to. There, near the buried tent that I had crawled out of, the falling snow outlined an absence. Empty air. A strong gust flung pale dusting off the ground to form a haze, and in it the shape was clear. I couldn't tell you what it was, only what it resembled. Long, snaking, and of simply vast size. It coiled through the haze the way an air bubble darts through water. 2, maybe 3 sparsely spaced legs jabbed at the ground, leaving clear imprints of whatever this thing was. Scythe-like mandibles sliced through the air towards me. It wasn't a hallucination. I could hear its sharp limbs clacking, feel its heavy steps through the ground. So I went back on my words and scampered back down to the ladder. Vertigo or not, I couldn't stand up against whatever that thing was. The girl was still tending to the man whose throat that I had torn out and shot a glance over to me. "Told you," she said with a smirk. "Oh, what was that? I couldn't see it while I could, but... Oh, it's fine, they won't come down here." I sank to the floor, if it could even be called that, and a sudden wave of despair overtook me. I hadn't the first clue where I was. Something deep in the recesses of my mind doubted that I was even on Earth anymore. I'm Eleanor, by the way. Shaken, I looked over to her with a grimace, and then promptly winced from the pain of freezing wind whistling through my teeth. Mine's Tony. Why? How are you so nonchalant right now? How long have you been here in this place? How long? Oh, you poor baby, time doesn't have a say anymore. Not for me. It's not if clocks work here, even if I wanted to know the time. A day could be months, years, and a night could be 5 minutes or vice versa. There's not many things a man can do when faced with impossibility. Do you deny to enkindle self-detriment, or accept and give up so easily? A question of a hopeless fight versus hopeless submission. Look, how about you come down with us, get some shelter? I know it's not optimal, but believe me when I say it's a paradise to living up here. Before, I had Rob to guide me. Whether he's still in the world that I knew or he's here somewhere, I don't know. I should hope that he made it out, but the coward in me also hopes to see him in this cursed place, to let him take the lead. And the same coward in me chose to stay with Eleanor, Kurt, and the rest. The rope ladder ran down through every level. A group of us sat on a 9-foot square base of cobbled ply and sheet metal, enclosed by flapping rolls of sun-bleached canvas and tarp, a room by some sliver of a margin. At the time there were 6 of us. A paler, sharp-faced man with a vaguely Slavic-tinged accent introduced himself as Alexei, and spoke on behalf of Kurt. "You see, friend, the hunger, it breaks down the strongest and the weakest man all the same. To eat anything substantial is rare, let alone something warm." Of the remaining 2 were Nia, a tan woman whose dappled skin displayed mild vitiligo, and an older gentleman bearing several tight pink scars over his hands. Same for his face as well, what could be seen of it past a graying beard. He doesn't remember his name, but everybody calls him Iago, or Santiago. Something Hemingway. Never read his works myself, but as far as wind-beaten fishermen go, Iago certainly looks the part. It took a while of idle chatter for me to finally come around to the question seeping through my thoughts. So, how do you survive here? 8 words were all it took to derail the conversation and have them exchanged pitied glances. "It ain't a matter of surviving, son," Iago rasped. "It's a choice between lesser evils." I was exasperated. What does that even mean, you old? Iago's sunken eyes toppled my will and I trailed off. He huffed, more with fatigue than frustration, as if issuing a sentiment that he had to repeat more times than he could remember. "Try as you might, you can't die in this place." I went to bite back but swallowed my words as I remembered Kurt. He laid beside us under a dirty sheet. Nia must have caught on because she reached over and tugged the fabric down to reveal Kurt's injury. Now his ruined throat was filled with what looked to be ice, only the ice looked tainted, putrid almost, with sallow mycelia exploding within. Crimson tributaries forced their way through the frost up on the left and down on the right. Tingling dread crept in a similar manner, up my spine and neck and flowing back down through my chest. If this was reality now, then well, I don't know. What moral is there? What sadistic law of nature permits this? I probably should have started off with this, but there's a name written inside the front cover. Anthony Grisha means as much to me as John Doe, but the handwriting matches whoever wrote in these pages, so it's safe to assume that they're one and the same. I realize now that I'm at a crossroads. I see two choices to make here: hide my discovery or report it. Honestly, I don't feel like keeping quiet and having to live with it. Luckily, I had the foresight of donning protective gloves before taking the journal, and I've been using them since, so my fingerprints aren't smeared all over the pages. Means that I can return it and then report through my satellite radio that I found a body, all without a hitch. Don't worry, I'll take photos of the pages I'm gonna transcribe. Over half of it is illegible though, whether due to numb fingers or a broken mind, I can't tell. I rang the project manager this morning, told her about the body, and she said to just hang in there. They won't be making any unnecessary trips apparently, and she knows as well as I do that the cold will prevent any losses in the realm of identification. Forensics will be along in the heli, which is due in 1 week. The first thing that I'm doing when I get home is having a hot shower for longer than it's probably healthy, and posting these logs. Returning the journal went smoothly, relatively speaking. Bending stiff fingers into place isn't the most pleasant of tasks, but I think that I'm in the all clear. Back to the matter at hand. Having a bit of a hard time writing all this from photos on my phone, but it'll do. I've cut a few parts which seem like pointless rambling, as well as pages marked by water damage and some disconcerting brown and red splotches. Here it is. I'm not sure why I keep on with this journaling. In no world do I imagine its pages will see the light of any day except the wildly inconsistent sun of this place. Though calling that thing a sun would be like calling a faulty light bulb a fireplace. There's no warmth or constancy to it, rather befitting for wherever we are. I also quite literally have all the time in the world. I guess I'm not in the world though, not anymore, not really. So I would like to describe my memories, my experiences, this godforsaken place in as vivid detail as possible, because that's how this place is. There's no hyperbole to be had. Its aspects, its nuances, all grim, lurid sores competing for my attention. Perhaps it's a comfort and nothing more. Reiteration for the sake of it. Well, I would rather think of anything else, any place else, but here is all there is. Maintenance. With no other choice, I learned quickly what to do and what to avoid, either empirically alongside my fellow captives or from their lessons. Every few actually, just whenever we need to. We set out in the snowfield above in alternating groups of 2 or 3. Oftentimes the invisible creatures moved to someplace else, leaving the path clear for us. I would let them use my ice picks, though I made it clear that if it was my turn, I would always have one in hand. The third member used some kind of socket wrench with a sharp stone driven into the end. The iceberg is possibly the most treacherous ground that I've ever had to traverse. Fissures hide under deceptive snow overhangs. One misstep on such unstable ground means falling 100 feet into an icy casket. That wouldn't be so bad since you could eventually climb your way out. Only the boar worms that tunnel deep inside the ice are quick to snatch up anything coming their way. And worse still, those see-through monsters come and go as they please. I myself have been caught, 8 odd times. The way their mandibles carve and cleave, they must be serrated because it hurts. It hurts so much that there's no real word for it. I would much rather not experience the sensation again, but we have to go searching. We have to. Most of the time we find little, usually nothing. A beaten metal sheet or frost-blackened planks are cause for celebration. You see, our cliff dwelling doesn't stay by itself. If only it were that easy. No, the iceberg is sinking constantly at a glacial rate into the abyssal brine below. Perpetual snowfall packs itself down into ice over time and roughly maintains the iceberg's elevation. So we have to deconstruct, dismember the lower levels and lug them back to the top. Drive old rebar into the cliff with blunt objects and fastened everything back together. If that's not work enough, the whole iceberg sways imperceptibly over time. It tilts forwards to precarious angles, resting for a drawn-out solstice before tipping backwards again. Lose your presence of mind and there's no second chance. Down into the freezing waters you go, torn apart by scaled monsters with their jagged spines and shark's teeth. Never blessed with the mercy of death until every cell in your violated body is torn and strewn asunder. Of course, there's a respite when the iceberg leans backwards. It's not something to get complacent with. Listen to that nagging reminder telling you that at some point, you'll be back in the same spot. That's your survival instinct talking, obsolete as it is. And even then, when you feel prepared for anything, this place always has an ace up its sleeve. Blubbers. My first introduction to this concept was, well, it was a while after my arrival. I would like to embellish the memory to say that we were sitting around a fire, something to that effect, but there was no chance of that. Even behind cover from the wind, it's like the warped physical laws here outright forbid as sparks and flames. And no, I sat beside Alexi and Nia on a pile of salt-crusted cloth. Without much else to pass the time, we had engaged in half-hearted games and hobbies. And contrary to his appearance, Iago had a strong singing voice. I'm kind of amazed that he can remember any songs. The man can't recall his own name for Pete's sake. I guess it's like Alzheimer's. Music's the last to flee memory, or so I've heard. At the time he stood out on the platform before us, he was singing, I think it was, Green, Green Grass of Home. In spite of the choppy gale his voice carried, it was pleasant, and this song in particular rang with a nostalgia. Once Iago had finished, he stood with his hands held together. "Hey, pretty good, old man," Alexi cheered. I bobbed my head in agreement. "Yeah, that's really something. God knows I wouldn't have pinned you as a singer," said Nia. Iago chuckled, and for a fleeting moment our troubles were lost. I guess we were too distracted to hear the heavy shuffling from below, because we fell back to silence when an enormous hand wrapped around the edge of the platform. Whatever pulled itself over that edge, it was no creation of any sane god. Gray blubbery flesh rippled in the wind. A disgusting, bloated thing the size of a tractor tire peered over at us. A head. Scattered perforations in these sides must have been ears, but it had no facial features other than a burbling, X-shaped hole right in the middle. 2 or 3 more sets of hands clambered their way up to us, somehow crawling up the ice as if they were geckos. None of these details held a candle to what their overall features resembled. Infants. Elephant-sized, hell-spawned toddlers crawling on all fours. Laggardly with age, Iago had no chance. Swollen, sticky fingers curled around his body, squeezing him in a grasp that even world record strongmen could not escape. The awful harmony they made upon claiming their new plaything is etched into my soul. Gargling coos of childlike elation, deep in pitch and easily drowning out his hysterics. In the brief period before they left, I watched oblivious to these screams of Nia and Alexi as the creatures shook him around and pulled at his limbs. All I could hear were joints and bones snapping and cracking. The creature holding Yago brought him up to the dribbling hole of its face. The hole dilated, revealing a cavernous passage of dripping flesh, and with slowness I'm sure was intentional, pushed him inside, feet first up to his neck. It closed around him with such pressure that I could hear his body breaking, and with crushed lungs he couldn't even scream. And just like that they descended, leaving us with a cold empty space shaped like an old man. That's how it goes here, no mercy, just suffering. Endless, indiscriminate suffering. Still, there are a handful of things that we can predict, or at the very least expect. The ice. Now it may be logical to melt the ice and drink it. We are, after all, still subject to thirst and hunger despite needing no food or water to live. Fresh snow from up above is okay, but the ice is bad water. It's rotten. It putrefies and becomes teeming with disease. In particular, it hosts some kind of parasite. Drink it and they'll start breeding inside you until your organs are rife with them. They sap any moisture they can from your body, drying you into a shriveled husk. Oh, and they're permanent too. There's literally no way to get them out. Now, I mentioned boreworms before. They're not an issue most of the time. Sometimes if you look deep into the ice cliff, you can see them burrowing within. They are lightning fast though, so I can never get a clear picture of them. From what I can gather, they're long, thick, and leech-like. Their heads open up to reveal strangely mechanical sets of spike balls which spin against each other to grind through the ice. I don't know if they're immune to the parasites. Maybe they're symbiotic. Worm eat ice, parasite take water, who knows? This nameless place has fates aplenty except for one: death. I didn't know how it worked at first, but it later on became clear. Months, perhaps even years after Yago's abduction, something happened that was gut-wrenching and incredible in equal measure. About 25 feet off from us, the ice began growing outwards. Small mounds at first, swelling like rotten pustules. It was when a familiar visage began forming that it clicked, and we built a walkway across. Through some uncouth law of nature, Yago grew in the form of an ice sculpture, and then color flushed his skin, staring at his fingertips and slowly spreading. He eventually broke free with a crack and a pop and fell down into our arms, vacant-eyed and nude. A grotesque and wholly unnatural birth. Yago was never the same after that. Deference held our tongues from prying, until the curiosity got too much to bear. Even when we prodded him and asked him about what had happened, not one word spilled from his lips. I shudder to think about what might have happened during his absence, at the hands of those abominations, things that considered him nothing more than a toy to wear out. We've taken to calling them blubbers. I would say it describes them to a T. With a honed skill at hiding, they're not too hard to avoid. The problem is hearing them approach before they arrive, because if you don't, well, no need to repeat what's already written. Past that, a worse revelation came to light. No matter what we do or what happens to us, no matter how violent or peaceful the death, we'll return. Spat right back out into the fray every time, no matter what. From this point, the frequency of errors in scribbling rises drastically. I find it strange the near instant transition from madman scrawl to legible, comprehensive records just a page over. As such, there's a few things left for me to post here. This reads as a fantasy, as most would have realized. In any other scenario, I would settle on that and leave it in the past. The reality is, however, there's a naked dead body hundreds of miles out in the tundra. Forensics will look for any signs of foul play, of course, but why come out this far to dispose of a body? How? And besides, there's no major trauma to the body. Unless he was posed like some grim marionette, the likely conclusion is he died from the cold. Emil, our geologist, wants the first half of tomorrow to confer and discuss our findings, so I'm gonna go and get some shut-eye. It's hard, admittedly, knowing there's a frozen cadaver in walking distance from me, but at least I don't have to bear that burden alone anymore. And good night for now. So, it's been a few days since I last wrote about this. I've been crunching pretty hard. Hopefully the quota's met before pickup arrives tomorrow. Though I think we'll have some spare time with the forensics team on site. Sorry, I'm stalling. Here's the next section. The Uncoupled. The brutality displayed in this realm is nothing to be scoffed at, but at the very least you grow accustomed to it. Meat and bone lose their sting, and yet there are some things the scars can't toughen you against. One in particular stands out to me. Kurt and I were on a scouting trip. We had long since made amends by this time and agreed to let bygones be just that. Plodding along the ridge of a snow dune, Kurt cocked his head to look at something, and then grabbed my shoulder with a wary firmness. Get down, now. We both dropped down below cover. I hadn't seen anything, but by now I trusted Kurt's judgment. What? What did you see? I caught it in the corner of me eye. Thank God I ain't look at it. Without thinking, I went to peek over into the open snowfield, and Kurt tore me back down by the scruff of my jacket, bringing me to eye level. What are you doing, you oaf? Don't look at it. I stared confused. At what? The Uncoupled. I should really get Ellie to go over. Whoa, slow down. Uncoupled. Yeah, don't look too deep into the name. I only seen it in the corner of my vision before. Just a dark shape. Nothing more than that, a stain. A stain on the world. Carefully, I turned my head in the direction that he had seen it, as if I'd be able to see right through the snow. Okay, and if you can't look at it, how do you know? I've been plenty here before you, mate. Knew one or two of them, this kid called Kent, yup. He said it was hollow and sort of an empty imprint that might have once been a person. I think he said something along the lines of, it's like if you took somebody and stripped everything away except their being. Still not sure what he really meant, but it's enough to know I ain't never gonna look at it. Well, that and the fact that a moment later he's already 30 feet ahead and stumbling towards it. I'm pausing to let Kurt's words sink in. I muttered, oh, well, where is he now? I mean, Miyago got taken and he came back. He shook his head, eyes focused on nothing. I couldn't tell ya. Only way I even remember him is 'cause of his voice. The screams, the god-awful wailing surfing across the dunes and through the air. In those short times when the wind stumbles and you just listen. Following his lead, I cocked an ear upwards, a frostbitten air slicing past my skin. There was nothing other than the howling gale and the hammering of my heart. However, the longer that I listened, I picked up on something distinct from the wind whistling. It did sound like screaming. For all I know, Kurt could have just been pulling a sick prank. It's easy to hear things that aren't out there, to see what you want to see. Only as I focused, it began to morph into the tone and timbre of a voice that I still remembered, one that I remembered well. It was the last voice that I had heard before this all happened. I tried not to think about it. Help me. The words were hissed straight into my ear. It startled me so bad that my legs straightened and I hopped off the ground. No question that time, it was his voice. After that, it wasn't a matter of not thinking about it, but of trying to forget. I must have been in a trance when Kurt spoke up again, snapping his fingers. Hey, you alright? Come on, we should get back. I ain't seen nothing out there worth the risk today. Just if you ever see something in the corner of your eye, something darker than dark, leave. I nodded, grimacing, and we made our way back down to our home. Weather. If constant freezing snowfall wasn't enough, the weather knows worst cruelty. For the most part, we have shelter if it starts raining anything untoward. If you're caught out on the snowfield though, well, let's say you'll be back in a few weeks at the best. Months or years at worst. That happened one time while Eleanor and Alexei went out scavenging. They must have been on their way back when it started raining these razor-sharp ice shards, finger-sized blades that sliced straight through canvas and embedded deep into wooden platforms. Pain snarls from above heralded Alexei's arrival, the rope ladder quivering under his descent. The best way that I can describe how he looked was as if a shrapnel grenade had detonated 3 feet in front of him. Well, all around him really. Deep weeping gashes littered his body and strands of flayed skin danced in the wind. It was like looking at a mangled human-shaped version of those cheese strings. You know, the ones that you peel strips off of. I wish I could taste one of those again. Anyway, there wasn't much that we could do except bandage him up, and even then it was more so we didn't have to see his injuries. I realized in my stupidity that something we had overlooked. He was alone. "Wait, Alexei, where's Ellie?" Nia whimpered. "Did she fall behind?" He sat there lifeless. It could have been the bandages wrapped around his head. I think he was just too broken to register the question. "Alexei, where is she?" With his throat and chest a pulpy mess, Alexei's voice was a little more than a grating rattle. "Didn't make it. Ankles, Achilles sliced to pieces. She fell down a crack." Nia just stood there, letting her head loll back and let out a forlorn wail into the sky. One of transparent despair and indignance at this world. One that I felt all too closely. I remember looking into the ice and seeing torn flesh dangling from a boarworm's mouth. Dull pink smudges carried through the ice as they tunneled. A while later, 2 or 3 weeks at a guess, her rebirth began. It seems that whenever this happens, they aren't too far away. 30 feet tops, but I don't want to jinx it. Maybe it's luck, more likely it's just how this place works. I dream sometimes of being reborn from the ice, only to fall out rigid and lifeless. But all we get are failed attempts. Very, very dark. I almost sympathize with the author, I just don't want to believe it. I would like to just pass it off as a testament to human creativity. Yet at the same time, is it better to be sure of true horror or to leave questions unanswered, left to echo around in the edifice of unknowing? I'll be thinking about that for sure, though something in me leans toward the latter. By tomorrow I'll have the answers, or so I hope. Until then, my modus operandi will be hammering out research and then sitting tight under a blanket. Stay safe out there. Early finish on the road today, which leaves me with 2 or 3 hours before our escort arrives. This is the final just about legible segment of the journal, and I can't help but have a strange feeling after reading it. There's a handful of disquieting notions in my head, but I'll save them for after. It's best to read this first, what is in effect a surrogate denouement. That said, there's no resolution to be had, no convergent threads. There's no satisfying conclusion for this dismal tome of events. Whatever the case, it's up to the reader to draw their own meanings, whatever you see fit. The storm. And there's one more thing I find worthy of putting on paper, and that is the storm. It happens at random according to Kurt. There's no pattern to its visits. I've only witnessed it twice in my time here. The first time it swirled on the distant skyline. I found myself totally wrapped in its magnificence, a terrifying sight to behold. We've been imprisoned in a night that must have lasted at least 2 or 3 years, relatively speaking, and in accordance with the darkness, the only light being the bruised, moonless firmament. It took a while for the black clouds to register congealing across the waters. Well, it wasn't hard to notice after deep crimson flashes lit up in its bowels, pulsing vermilion glimmers so full of energy that I could feel heat wash over my face from across the waters. That heat grew into a roiling whirlwind as the storm neared. The others were quick to stir from their meager shut-eye when they too felt it. "What the heck's that?" Nia stammered, evidently as clueless as I was. "Oh no, no, please God, no, not again," Kurt croaked. "Guys, what's happening? What is that out there?" I asked. "Storms are coming." We all turned to Yago and Sink. Those were the only words that he had spoken since he had returned from the blubbers, and the mere sound of his voice came as a shock. We pressed for details, but he had already sunken back to his dead-tongued dejection. Kurt was no help either. He just shivered and stared paralytic into the churning depths of the storm head. I'll be honest, after the storm drew nearer and pattering rain replaced the snow, a certain excitement overtook me. Inky blots darted across the flashing lights deep in the storm clouds, captivating me in awe. I threw my head back and opened my mouth, allowing the rain to spread its warmth across my tongue. It felt heavenly. The sensation of warmth after so long deprived was like nothing that I had felt before. The euphoria was short-lasting, and concern replaced it as the raindrops turned scalding. When they started to burn and sizzle off my face, I flinched and dove back under cover. Before long, the air was an all-enveloping haze of steam. It was like we had just entered some malfunctioning steam room. Each breath brought with it a flaring heat that spread from my lungs to the rest of my organs. Funny, isn't it? In winter, it's cold and dreary and you wish it was summer instead, and then when summer rolls around, the beating sun and stifling nights make you yearn for the cooler seasons. In that boiling cloud, I begged for the cold to come back. At least we could layer up in coats and pants. There's nothing to be done about the heat. You can't exactly take your skin off when it's too hot. Momentary relief came as cool trickling streams from above, but my relief was sorely misguided when I understood what it was. Meltwater. Minor runnels quickly inflated to a formidable downpour, and then into a violent rapid. Nothing could be heard over the roar of rushing water. Blind, breathless, and panicking, I reached out for a hold, my fingers wrapped around metal, a pole driven into the ice. I held on with everything that I had. There was a thump beside me, a gurgled shriek. Eleanor. Despite my total exertion to keep from being swept away, I outstretched a hand. "Ellie, here, grab it," I screamed, a candle in the wind to the rapids. Without delay, I felt her slippery fingers intertwine with my own. I heaved. I felt as if my spine would snap right there and then. I just didn't have the strength. The cold torrent sapped all the excess energy from my muscles. "Help me!" Following the cry, I barely made out the figure of Kurt clinging helplessly to a torn canvas. The steam swallowed him up again, and my stomach knotted when a harsh tearing noise scraped my eardrums. In total uncut despair, I watched as Kurt plummeted past the platform and out of sight. And as if on cue, Ellie's fingers slipped away. My heart felt as empty as my palm. Her screams faded from my ears, replaced by the incessant torrent. I don't remember the wait following, only the waterfall suddenly abating, giving way to familiar gray murk hanging in the sky. Kurt and Eleanor were gone. In any other situation, I might have found solace knowing that they had drowned, or perhaps even died on impact with the ocean. Of course, that was out of the question. We were left knowing with absolute certainty that they were going through unimaginable suffering, and far more to come. Whether at the hands of unseen leviathans, blubbers, or any other nameless things lurking in the depths, it didn't matter. I just hoped whatever found them was vicious enough to tear them apart, digest their bodies into nothing, and allow them to return. A week passed and Eleanor began to regrow. Another 2 weeks later and Kurt appeared. After their rebirth, we all knew better than to prod. Just leave them be, let them process it, and let them decompress. Loss may seem a trivial affliction without death, but it would be naive to think of loss as a purely physical separation. Yes, you may be taken away, put through unspeakable suffering, and then be reborn. For lack of a better term, those victims lose some integral part of their being, slowly chipped and whittled away. Something so abstract, so important, yet it cannot be grasped by the hand. Once it's gone, there's no reeling it back. And still we went on. We had no choice and fell back on mindless habits for comfort. In a way, we found a paltry success in learning what makes this place tick. Trial and error, however awful those trials have been. My thoughts lingered on the storm after it happened a second time. We were seasoned, prepared for what was to come, making sure that our cover was uninfiltrated by the elements. We pulled together ropes and twine and tied them around ourselves and fastened the ends to various driven poles and stakes. Maybe I had been too focused on the storm and its sizzling droplets to catch Iago unfastening himself and standing up. A yell from Alexei brought me to attention, but it was too late. Iago, already several paces away, lumbered toward the edge of the platform. We all thought that he would jump, futile as it'd be, but he didn't. Instead, he threw off his shoes, socks, jacket, and pants, everything, until he stood stark naked, exposed to the elements. At this point, we knew better than jumping up to help. We had no fault in this. He would come back eventually after all. Yet I could sense something changing. I don't know what or when it started, but it was there. A shift, a redirection of energy. He howled as his skin bubbled and blistered under the storm's ferocity. I think it was when his skin began sloughing off in great swaths that it happened. Without warning, Iago's entire being burst into a furious red flame. The sparkling vermilion plasma crackling with the intensity of lightning. Eyes watering from the heat, I watched transfixed as his silhouette, shrouded in fire, seemed to be eaten away into nothing. Not a puff of smoke or steam billowed from him. His backlit shadow disintegrated inch by inch, until the last smattering of fragments were burned away entirely. Absolutely nothing remained of him once the storm passed. Not one stray hair or nail fragment. Of course, we expected him to grow out from the ice face, right away in fact, but nothing happened. We scanned every last inch of the cliff. Nothing. It's been hell. I can't even guess how long it's been since then. It's all just so arbitrary, meaningless. Could be decades, centuries, millennia. My family might be long dead by now. Even humanity could already have gone extinct. And in all that time, I've yet to see even a hint of Iago's return. Maybe he's in another, worse place. Maybe he's dead. Or maybe he made it back home. Those are the only possibilities that I can imagine, and as far as I can see, that's a 2/3 chance of escaping this place, escaping eternity. Next time the storm comes around, I think that I'll follow that old man's example. Stripped down to my most human form, raw for the whole world to see. Well, not completely. I'll be bringing this notebook with me. I'll clutch it tight to my heart as the tempest roars around us. And maybe, just maybe, the rain will set me free. So here we are. I'm not really sure what to make of this. It's almost like two situations bound as one. An unexplainable body and an unbelievable journal. Together, it's like the opposite poles of two magnets pulling together into some cohesive whole. But as I said in the prologue to this entry, there are still a few things that I keep thinking over and over to no avail. According to the journal, the last location that I can identify would be Monte Rosa. That's between Italy and Switzerland, over 3,000 miles away from here. Even if somebody wanted to dump a body, they would need air transport. There are no roads not this far out. There are plenty of remote places to bury a body, and here is not one of them. Permafrost starts less than 2 feet down, so you're more likely to break your shovel before digging out a grave. But if there is a third party involved, why would they pose the body? Unless they simply left him here to die, but why? I hear something. I think that the chopper's here. I'll see what I can gather from the forensics guys and to finish this afterwards. Wow, I didn't expect them to be so forthcoming. They flicked through the journal and ran a missing persons check for one Anthony Grisha, and it's true. British, last known location 11 days ago, climbing Monte Rosa with a friend who's also missing. We've been here 2 weeks though, and I only found the body 5 days in. which means the longest period between disappearance and discovery would be 2 days. I'm starting to get a headache trying to rationalize all this, and there's something else bothering me too. Is there an old man missing from somewhere in the world? Somebody who could be compared to a certain Hemingway character? If so, will he be found somewhere cold and isolated, or perhaps somewhere more populated? And if he's found alive, what would he say? What would he recount? In all honesty, I hope these questions stay unanswered. I don't want to know. Whatever he'd reveal to the world does not belong here. It might prove something that should remain in the dark, quiet, unknown. A place that I've already stepped one misguided foot into.